This page is the front cover of N64 Magazine, proper retro stuff from back in '98. It's screaming about Wipeout 64, go faster, as if we weren't already hyped for that one. Every track, every secret, all you need to know. Bit of a claim, lads, but alright. They've got the reviews in yellow boxes, N98, up for the cup again, must be another footy game from them. Buck Bumble is there too. Stinging bee emup action, yeah, that was a weird one where you played as a bee. And F1 World GP apparently got a champagne rating at last, so must be decent then. Down the side, there's a plus section, listing off a bunch of other games they're covering in the mag like ODT, Silicon Valley, Scars, can't say I remember that last one. Then Micro Machine 64, always good for a laugh with mates, WCW Revenge for the wrestling fans, Extreme G2 for more futuristic racing, and Pocket Monsters Stadium must be Pokemon Stadium, that was massive at the time, guesser. At the bottom, little boxes plugging Japanese and US news and reviews, and then tiny pictures for Tonic Trouble and Rogue Squadron. So yeah, looks like a packed issue, 132 pages of N64 goodness, according to them anyway, and all for £2.95, bargain, eh? This page then, it's the contents page from N64 Magazine, issue 20. Right in the corner as usual, James Ashton, the editor, is banging on about how fast the N64 scene is growing, mentioning F1 World Grand Prix as an example. They were surprised to see a finished version so quickly after seeing it at some show. He reckons it's the best racing sim they've ever seen, bit strong isn't it? Says to turn to page 62 if you don't believe him. Then he's on about Wipeout 64, saying if you're bored of F1 then Wipeout is the game to go for. They were skeptical about the PlayStation conversion, but now they've seen a near-finished copy, they're well up for it. New tracks, 4-player racing, good music, and he mentions F-Zero X on the horizon too. Says the N64 isn't short of races anymore, which was probably true enough at the time. Funny he mentions his football team, Ipswich Town, not scoring goals. Relatable for many fans back then I suppose. He's relieved N98 has finally arrived in PAL format. Looking at the contents, there's a news centre bit on page 16 about Howie Lincoln visiting ECTS, and apparently Turok gets a jumper, loads of tat too, whatever that means. Coming soon on page 20 lists a bunch of games. Winback, Hybrid Heaven, Turok 2, Castlevania, Glover, Fighting Force, and loads more. There's a little screenshot from what looks like Hybrid Heaven there. Then it's the usual sections like Planet 64 and N64 Arena, both starting on page 16, covering UK releases and reviews, and rated and completed games. N98 gets a mention on page 54, with Ray saying it's back bigger and better. Biofreaks is on page 60, with a warning about losing your head or limbs. Cheeky. F1 Grand Prix on 62, called the best racing sim in the world again, they're really pushing that one. Mortal Kombat 4, on page 68, beat people to death with their own arm, nice and gruesome. Cruising World on 70 is called Slow, Easy Rubbish, not that surprising. Ouch. Chopper Attack on 71 is Wild Choppers, Buddha, Bang. Buck Bumble on 72, Best Things in Life RB. Right. Then there's Import Arena, starting on page 78 for Japanese and American games. Wildcus. Under Regulars, they've got Information Station, Tube Talk, N64 Shopper, Club 64, Subscriptions, Back Issues, Directory, and a tease for N64 Magazine issue 21. What's coming next? It's got teeth. Games listed in this Regulars section include Rakuga Kids, Waialae Country Club Golf, Bomberman B-Damon, Choroku 64, and Super Robot Spirits. Just a standard contents page really, gives you a quick overview of what's inside. This page then, it's the contents for the magazine, right? Future Look is teasing some upcoming games. You see Silicon Valley, Extreme G2. Remember, Extreme G was supposed to be a Wipeout beta, wasn't it? Micro Machines and WCW Revenge are in there too. Then there's How To, probably for cheat codes and stuff. Competition results, someone won something, good for them, and the big feature is Special Investigation, Wipeout 64. They were banging on about Wipeout on everything back then seemed like. Down below you've got WWF Warzone, always with the wrestling games, and Pocket Monsters Stadium. That Japanese craze was just starting to get going big here. ODT and Tonic Trouble are mentioned, vaguely remember those being alright, and then Hype and Scars, which sound a bit forgettable to be honest. Wipeout 64 though, that was a proper fast racer for the N64, looked good at the time. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 20, looks like a preview section called Look. It's all about the upcoming N64 games. Right at the top, you've got this mad-looking cartoon character, a bit of a bizarre fella, Rie. The main feature is on Space Station Silicon Valley. They reckon it's been in development for ages but is finally arriving. Sounds like a platform puzzler where you possess robotic animals. They mention gunboat walruses and helirabbits, which sounds properly bonkers, doesn't it? Apparently you have to kill an animal to possess it, which is a bit dark when you think about it. They compare it to Mario 64 meets Blast Corps, with a bit of Paradroid thrown in, which is quite a mix. They're saying it could be one of the top games of the year, but we'll see about that, won't we? EC. Then there's Extreme G2. It's the sequel to Extreme G. They are wondering if it can challenge Wipeout 64 and F-Zero X. Bold claims, but we had plenty of racers back then, didn't we? More. Next up is Micro Machines 64. Super Small Racing meets the N64. Can't go wrong with a bit of Micro Machines, always good for a laugh with mates. Chassis gassy. Lastly, they've got WCW vs NWO Revenge, with The Men in Pants Are Back, which is a bit of a silly tagline. Wrestling games were always popular though. There's also a mention of a coming soon section on page 20, if you want more new games. Overall, it's a quick look at what was on the horizon for the N64 back then. Space Station Silicon Valley seems to be the one they're really pushing though. This page in N64 Magazine, they're previewing Space Station Silicon Valley. Right in your face with big yellow text, Silicon Valley dog eat dog. Very dramatic. Seems to be one of those games where you control different animals. They're talking about the levels being set in different environments. Arctic, desert, jungle, and some European ones too. Apparently there's indoor bits, sewers, and even something called a rat-o-matic, which sounds a bit bonkers, turning mice into horrible rats apparently. They're saying the European levels are designed to teach you the basics before you get to the tougher Arctic levels. Which makes sense, I suppose. There's a bit about sniffing around for hidden glowing balls, 15 on each level, to get 100% completion. Sounds like one of those collectathon things that were pretty common back then. And a section called Leave It, Bad Dog, which is about dogs in sewers, saying it's not a great place for them, full of sewage and rats. Charming. They've got some screenshots showing gameplay, a penguin dealing with a husky, suggesting you can play as a penguin. One caption mentions zooming out to see the level layout, another has a fox, and says the fox can't be killed by something. There's also a screenshot of a level full of sheep-looking things. They reckon it's a level full of jumps and ramps, so fluffy bundles of fun can frolic around. Right then. Release date is October, for both the UK and the US, so not too long to wait if it takes your fancy. Seems like they're trying to build up a bit of hype, but it's just another game preview really, nothing too groundbreaking at first glance, but who knows, might be a bit of fun when it comes out. This page from N64 Magazine takes a look at Space Station Silicon Valley. Remember that one? It's having a gander at the battery farm level. They're calling Dan Danger an incompetent space adventurer, which is a bit harsh, isn't it? Warrington, the how it works bit, explains that you start off as a weak animal, in this case a mouse, and have to complete objectives to get through the level. Apparently you'll need to become something stronger later on, which was the general idea in these sorts of games back then. Step 1. They're setting the scene, saying your goals are to raise bridges, grow carrots and switch off an electric fence. Sounds simple enough, on paper anyway. Bika. Step 2. Points out you start as a humble mouse, stuck in a pit. Number 3 tells you to get out of said pit by using ramps and turbo. Fair enough. 1. Step 4 is basically where to next, reminding you about the bridges, fence and carrots. Step 5, there's a bridge, but the switch to raise it is on the other side, and apparently, blue mice can't jump, which is a crucial bit of info. Step 6 shows some sheep in a pen, suggesting animals that can jump, and Step 7 shows a ramp up to it. Step 8. Whee! You'll believe a mouse can fly? Bit dramatic, eh? But it's just showing the mouse flying off the ramp, naturally. Doit. Step 9 mentions sheep are defenseless, but watch out for the ram. Tail attack on the ram. Swipe, swipe. Got it. Finally, Step 10. Possess a sheep to float over the bridge. Right you are then. Seems like a fairly typical level for the time. Bit of puzzle solving and platforming using different animals. Good old N64 days. This page in N64 Magazine, right? It's got one of those stop, look, listen sections, you know, the ones with little tips. This one's about finding hidden animals by doing tasks in the game. Apparently they're pre-killed for your amusement. Charming. It mentions pesky foxes and sheep owner spring, and something about a speedboat. Sounds like typical N64 silliness. Then there's a step-by-step guide for a level. Screenshots numbered from 11 to 20. Looks like you're playing as a sheep, going through some kind of obstacle course. First, you got to touch a switch. Then there's a bridge that's too far to jump. Clever bit? You switch a tap to grow carrots, which become steps. Task completed. Then you trot around, down a slope, raise those carrot steps again. Another task done. Electric fence is up next. Apparently, there are foxes to watch out for, nasty things that kill sheep in seconds, so you're told to get a rocket dog. Rocket dog, you gotta love it. They even show you the stats for the rocket dog in screenshot 17. Things like water resistance and engine electric, proper nerdy stuff. You then switch off an electric fence, and finally wheel yourself into a kennel to teleport out. Level done, but apparently there's still secrets to find. Lastly, at the bottom there's a coming soon bit for Space Station Silicon Valley by DMA Design. They reckon it's looking pretty good even in this early version, saying the controls are milky, graphics are crisp, and the music is foot-tappingly cheesy. Sounds about right for a DMA game back then, bit quirky and hopefully fun. This is October 98 issue, so must have been getting close to release around then. This page is a look at Extreme G2, the follow-up to Extreme G on the N64. It seems they were pretty impressed with the original Extreme G, mentioning it sold 700,000 copies, which back then was a fair whack. They're calling Extreme G2 a surprise sequel, saying it's almost a completely different game, stripped back and rebuilt. Probe, the developers, have clearly listened to feedback about the first one being a bit unforgiving, as they've made the tracks wider and slowed the bikes down a touch for better control. Visually, they reckon XG2 is amazing, even comparing it to F-Zero X in terms of looks, which is high praise indeed. They're going on about incredible tunnel systems, with decor straight out of the Alien films. Apparently there are 36 tracks across 12 worlds, or 12 tracks split into thirds for each world. Sounds like they're trying to make it last. They mention easy, medium and hard difficulties, and you unlock more levels as you get better standard fare for the time. There are little callouts on the screenshots too. One points out the trails left by the bikes, saying they're taking inspiration from Wipeout. Can't blame them for that. Wipeout was ace. Another mentions the viewing distance being excellent, always a good thing in a racer. They also highlight the detail and resolution being high, and the polygon count being minimal, typical N64 talk in it. Another screenshot shows a Cloud City level, and then a jungle section, saying to use your weapons wisely there. And lastly, they mention underground caves with nitros on the left. Sounds like a bit of track design trickery to watch out for. All in all, seems like they're pretty chuffed with it and reckon it's going to be a good racer. We shall see when it finally comes out though, eh? This page is all about Extreme G2, looking like a futuristic motorbike racing game for the N64. It's titled Suspension of Belief, highlighting the new realistic suspension in the game. Apparently Probe spent ages making sure each bike part was just right so you can see the wheels bouncing when you're racing, which sounds pretty cool for the time, makes it feel a bit more real, doesn't it? There's a screenshot showing the in-game HUD with speed and lap times, and you're racing through some tunnel, looks quite fast-paced. Another little screenshot shows a different track, maybe outdoors this time, with some alien-looking design cues they mention. Something about Alien films inspiring the look. Apparently there's also a Muga bike, making a return with a redesign, if you remember that from the first game. The main image on the right is of a futuristic-looking woman racer. She's got a helmet and breathing gear. Very sci-fi, very 90s. They are saying the graphics are astounding, and they've minimized fogging so you can see far into the distance, which was always a bit of a problem in some of these early 3D games, wasn't it? Good news if you like seeing where you're going. Apparently weapons are easier to spot now, with green circles on the track, and you get a voice telling you what you picked up. A sassy voice no less, that's what they say here. The big new thing is rear-firing missiles, so you can watch yourself take out opponents in your rear-view mirror. That sounds a bit cheeky. They're also saying it's remarkably bloody, bits of bike flying off when you crash, red stuff splattering across the track. Sounds a bit over the top maybe, but I suppose it adds to the spectacle. New release date is late October. They reckon it's coming out just in time to go head-to-head with Wipeout and F-Zero. Big talk, those were the kings of futuristic racing back then, weren't they? They're hoping to review it in the next issue of N64 Mag, and they're clearly quite excited for it. Says get ready for some speed, which is a bit much, but you know, it's magazine talk. October 1998. Yeah, feels about right for when this sort of thing was coming out. This page showcasing Micro Machines, blimey, V3 on the N64, remember that? It's plastered all over the page in massive pink letters, can't miss it. They're calling it the most addictive racer ever. Bit strong lads, but alright, we'll see. They've got a load of screenshots dotted about showing these tiny cars racing on bonkers tracks. Looks like you're dodging explosions, racing around a snooker table, and even jumping playing cards. One bit mentions breakfast racing, comparing it to a bowl of Alpen Charming. They also mention 8 players at once, which back then was a proper selling point for a laugh with your mates. Looks like classic Micro Machines chaos, just bumped up a generation for the N64. Probably a decent bit of fun for a multiplayer session, if you were into that sort of thing. This page is about Micro Machines 64 Turbo, right? And it's billed as an exclusive future look in the magazine. Basically, they're saying if you've played Micro Machines before, you know what to expect: tiny cars causing mayhem. Apparently this one's for the N64, and it's using the engine from Micro Machines V3, which was alright. They reckon the camera is better, less wobbly, which was a bit of a pain in version 3 if you remember. Born Sting. They're banging on about loads of game modes, classic stuff like tournaments and multiplayer, head-to-head, team races, the whole shebang, plus party modes and time trials as you do. And get this, they're chucking in weapons and prize cars too. Apparently you can even save your souped UP motor on a memory pack and show off to your mates. Fancy that. Borington nodes. Course-wise, they're saying there's a massive 48 tracks, some old favourites from previous games, and some new ones made for the N64. They mention the pool table is back, always a laugh. But now they've got a kitchen table level, garden shed, and even a science lab. Looking at the screenshots, the kitchen one has got breakfast bits and bobs, the garden shed is full of tools and nails, and the science lab has beakers and stuff. Sounds like the usual Micro Machines craziness, really. Warrant. Vehicles are getting a bit of a shake-up too. Speedboats are in, helicopters are back. Remember how hard they were to control? Monster trucks for rough terrain, and they're even teasing F1 cars. So yeah, Micro Machines 64 Turbo, coming in November apparently. They sound pretty chuffed with it. We'll see if it's any good, won't we? This page is showcasing WCW vs NWO Revenge for the N64. Looks like a first play sort of thing from THQ. First ever play of THQ's new Wrestleathan, they're calling it. A bit much, aren't they? Anyway, it's got some screenshots, proper N64 blurry like we were used to. One shows Hollywood Hulk Hogan winning, and the caption is a bit cheeky, saying, ironic name, considering his hilarious movie career. He wasn't exactly De Niro, was he? There's Raven looking all moody and gothic in another shot, and someone getting a right good smack with a plank of wood and a table. Eat my shorts! It's best not to lie down when your opponent's got full spirit. Proper schoolboy humor there. And they're banging on about the crowd looking more realistic now, no more steamrollered cardboard fans. Well, they're still a bit blocky, but I suppose it's progress. Says it's coming out in September in the US and November over here, so a bit of a wait for us then. WCW vs NWO Revenge. Could be a decent grappler, this one. This page right then, it's all about WCW vs NWO Revenge for the N64. Proper wrestling game this was shaping up to be. They're saying wrestling games are getting good when you can have 4 players causing chaos, and Revenge is looking like it'll deliver on that grudge match action. Worried to... They've got some screenshots here showing the in-game action, one showing a right old ruckus with loads of wrestlers in the ring. Classic tag team stuff. Another with a wrestler getting a good kicking caption says, oh yeah, they're really rumbling tonight, that's gotta hurt. Then there's another where someone's getting a proper head stomping, described as too horrible to watch, but hopefully just minor brain damage, ha! And the last one shows a wrestler ready for a finishing move, with Raven apparently about to be very surprised. The article itself is saying they're bringing back the likes of Lex Luger, Randy Macho Man Savage, and Hollywood Hogan, all those ridiculously muscle-bound blokes. They reckon this game is going to give WWF Warzone a run for its money, Warzone being the game everyone was playing at the time. Apparently the first WCW vs NWO game wasn't amazing, but this Revenge one is looking like a proper sequel, bigger, better, more of everything. Loads more wrestlers, improved graphics, and a whopping 128 meg cart, which was massive back then. They're talking about new weapons like dustbins and briefcases, giving you a whole 20 seconds to find them before you get counted out, so expect fights spilling into the crowd with baseball bats and lead pipes. Sounds like mayhem. They mention a spirit meter to help you make a comeback, even if you're getting battered. Visual improvements are in the arenas, based on proper WCW pay-per-views like Halloween Havoc and Bash at the Beach, plus Thunder and Monday Nitro arenas. You can even play through a WCW season to win the championship. Each wrestler has their own entrance with music and dramatic ice fog, and apparently they don't suffer from clipping, which was a bit of a problem in the original game. Action replays are in too, which is a nice touch. Overall, they reckon it's not quite as slick as Warzone, but the sheer size of the game and the improved gameplay should make it a worthy contender. They're expecting to review the final game properly in time for Christmas. Sounds alright, doesn't it? This page of Planet 64 is shouting about Nintendo doing rather well, it seems. Apparently Shigeru Miyamoto, the mastermind behind Mario, is coming to London for the ECTS show. Bit of a big deal they reckon, having him pop over. They're making a right fuss about Zelda 64, or Ocarina of Time as it's properly called, being the main attraction, Nintendo's best game ever, which is always the claim, isn't it? F-Zero X is also getting a mention, as being there at the show, and they're proper chuffed about Banjo-Kazooie topping the charts. That Bird and Bear game seems to have gone down a storm. Sounds like the N64 is finally shifting a few units over here. They say UK sales are almost matching Japan's in Europe, which is good news for Nintendo, and probably us gamers too in the long run, I suppose. This page in the mag is having a bit of a chuckle because the N64 mag is still shifting copies like hotcakes. They're kicking off with some shortcuts news, mentioning that Vigilante 8, which is like Twisted Metal but with better graphics, is coming to the N64. They reckon it'll be like Mario Kart Battle Mode, but without Bowser, which sounds alright. T-Ut. Then there's a bit about a Lorry Laugh section which is about the Nintendo Challenger, a big truck that's going around to shows where you can play demos. Apparently it's got GoldenEye, Banjo-Kazooie, Mario 64, and F1 World Grand Prix on it. They mention it's going to be at some Max Mania thing, and also some BBC Big Bash, later in November, where you might even get a look at Zelda 64, which was the talk of the playground back then. And before that, it's at Manchester for 1080 snowboarding. The main bit is about how well the magazine is doing. They're bragging, in a very British way, about selling loads of mags, even beating PlayStation Magazine when it comes to Colin McRae Rally. They also mention Tomb Raider and Gran Turismo being popular on the PlayStation at the time, but Banjo-Kazooie was doing the business for the N64. They reel off a load of upcoming games, like Zelda and F-Zero X, Perfect Dark, V-Rally 64, Wipeout 64, and Conker's Bad Fur Day. Big hitters all of them. Gorrington Nolsa. They're saying thanks to everyone for buying the mag and promising even more stuff next month, like reviews, tips and exclusives, and even free gifts for Christmas. Finally, there's a bit claiming Turok 2 is going to be bigger than Zelda. Bit of a bold claim. Apparently, it's going to be on a massive 256 meg cartridge and might even use the expansion packs to run in a higher resolution mode like All-Star Baseball did. They show a picture of a jumper pack which most of us probably had stuck in our consoles at that point, unless you forked out for the proper expansion pack. Good times. This page is a bit of a mixed bag really, typical sort of stuff you'd find in N64 mag back in the day. Oh, right at the top left there's Pockmarks, talking about the pocket camera being popular, selling loads, people defacing themselves with it, which sounds about right for the time. Then there's Derby County mentioning Destruction Derby for the N64, saying it's going to be in 2 parts and about car carnage in an arena. Sounds like more of the same really, those games were alright for a bit of mindless fun. Cheap Cheap is about World Cup 98 being reduced in price, about time too. Those EA footy games were always a bit pricey. Core Blimey is about Core Design saying they're doing 2 more games after Fighting Force, and wondering when the Tomb Raider deal expires. Everyone was mad about Tomb Raider back then, fair enough. Down the page we've got Fanzine Farm. There's a review of Challenge 60 Score, which is a fanzine all about beating games quickly, apparently comes with tips, cheats, and even a serrated kitchen knife to open it. Bit weird, but alright. It's got stuff on GoldenEye and Turok, Level 0 revealed, whatever that means. Seems like you can order it for 75p, cheap as chips. Then there's 64 Supreme Fanzine, which sounds a bit more serious. It's all in colour, and got reviews and previews of games like Banjo-Kazooie is here, Hybrid Heaven, Zelda 64, Winback and Wipeout 64. Lot of big hitters there for the time. It's got a free disc of screenshots, fancy. Cost you £2.50 for that one. Necker. Over on the right side it's New Goods. All about Nintendo branded tat really. First up is a Nintendo Ghetto Blaster, which they say is rubbish quality. The aerial falls off, the tuning is off, and it looks naff, so pretty much what you'd expect from cheapo merchandise like that. Then there's Nintendo Binoculars. They reckon they are blurry and not very good. Surprise, surprise. Super Mario 64 Walkie-Talkies. They say the range is about the distance between your feet and your head. Very useful then. Bit sarcastic there from the reviewer. Lastly, Nintendo 35mm camera. They say it's heavy and got a big viewfinder, but the picture quality isn't great, nothing like the posh photos in Cosmopolitan mag. So yeah, a load of new Nintendo branded stuff, mostly a bit pants, but someone would buy it I suppose. This page in N64 Magazine features a section called Retro World with Jason Moore. Looks like they're having a look back at some old handheld games, alongside some bits for the N64. First up, there's a bit about F-Zero X, saying if you beat it on the hardest setting you get a random track generator, which sounds quite clever, even now. They say they'll have more news on it soon. Laue. Then there's a review for a Nugent N64 controller, a blue one. Seems like they were quite impressed with it for a third-party pad, especially the analog, stick and button feel. They gave it a decent 91%, reckon it's worth the money, about 20 quid. Next to that is a review of a Nintendo stereo radio. Sounds like a cheap bit of kit you might find in a bargain bin. They weren't too keen, couldn't even pick up Radio 5 properly, and reckon it makes a constant noise. Got a measly 26%. Looks about right for something like that. Chuku. The Retro World section is all about Game & Watch games. Jason prefers the ones that open sideways, rather than top to bottom. Which is fair enough, they were a bit less common. First game is Rain Shower, where you're drying washing and have to dodge drips. Sounds simple, lining up shirts, but he reckons it's trickier than it looks and a bit of a strange theme for a game. Then there's Fireball, a single screen game where you bounce a ball between flippers. Apparently it's got 75 ball positions, which for a handheld back then is not bad. They say it's playable even with the limitations, and the colourful screens are nice. It gets 81%. Beater. Warranty. After that is Safebuster. It's described as a bit like Codebreaker but not dull. You're a policeman on a roof trying to catch bombs thrown by a robber and stop them blowing up the bank. You've got a jug to catch the bombs and have to empty it. Sounds a bit frantic. They gave this one 89%. And no sir. Lastly there's Pinball. He says it's a smart double-screen game, typical Game & Watch style with its own colours. Black exterior and faceplate, and a difficult game to emulate they reckon. Gets 84%. At Lamos. At the bottom there's Jason Moore's contact details if you needed to get in touch about retro games I suppose. Address in Bletchley. That's about it for this page, a mixed bag of new and old. This page in N64 Magazine is all about the upcoming game Violent, or Winback as it's actually called. Bit of a weird title choice there lads. Apparently it's Koei's first go at an N64 game. Usually they're all about strategy stuff, which can be a bit slow going, but this sounds more like they're trying to do a GoldenEye meets Metal Gear Solid kind of thing. Stealthy missions, tension, all that jazz. You play as this bloke called Jean-Luc Cougar, sounds a bit posh, who's some sort of special agent fighting terrorists called the Crying Lions. Sounds a bit dramatic. The levels are split up into areas, and you have to be sneaky or the terrorists will notice you. Apparently they're not daft like the goons in GoldenEye, and you don't have Bond's massive arsenal, so you gotta be clever about it, use surprise attacks. They even say the bad guys have their own routines and will check out any noises, and they're stubborn buggers who won't leave their posts easily. Jean-Luc is supposed to be quite athletic, can sprint and dive about, hide behind things, a bit like a ninja really, and he's good at sniping, so you can pick off guards from a distance. Sounds alright I suppose. They seem hopeful that Koei, who aren't really known for this type of game, can pull it off. There's also a list of other games they're covering this month, bits and bobs about Castlevania 64, Hybrid Heaven, Turok 2, Seeds of Evil, Rogue Squadron, Glover Fighting Force, and of course, The Legend of Zelda. Lots to look forward to. Looking at the screenshots, there's one where it's all explosions, which they say will be the death of you. Another one's a bit of a posed shot. And the magazine guys are taking the mix saying, yeah, nice pose. Shame everyone's gone to watch the National Lottery. Then there's one where you've got a red dot on an enemy, they say blow his head off. Charming. And lastly, one that's described as misty but detailed. Sounds like your typical N64 graphics then. This page is about Hybrid Heaven, one of Konami's big hitters for the N64 coming out next year. Alongside Castlevania 64 it seems. They've got some new pictures to show off, and it's looking, well, polygonal, as you'd expect back then. Apparently the story is still a bit of a mystery, even though it's meant to be out in about 7 months. They're banging on about the battle system being really interesting. According to the director bloke Yasuo Daikai, we haven't seen much of it yet, but apparently, where you get hit matters and you can choose from low, medium or high moves. The cutscenes are supposed to be a standout feature, and it's a massive 128 meg cart, which they reckon might be struggling to hold everything. One of the screenshots shows some doors, apparently important in the game, and another one has you facing off against some alien creature. They reckon the running action is absolutely superb, so we shall see about that when it finally arrives. This page in N64 Magazine, it's all about Castlevania 64, or just Castlevania as they're calling it here. Right then, so it's an exclusive look at it, which back then meant something I suppose. They reckon it's more scary than violent, which is fair enough for Castlevania, isn't it? Lots of werewolves and vampires and creepy crawlies, all that sort of thing. Apparently the development team are aiming for shocks and shivers, which sounds promising. The reviewer reckons it's more realistic than the old 2D versions, which you'd expect in 3D, wouldn't you? There's a screenshot showing Belmont, whip in hand of course, taking on some beastie, one of Castlevania's many beasts they say. Another screenshot is captioned, "Burn in hell Belmont." Haha, our hero looks a bit hot under the collar. Bit cheesy if you ask me, but alright. Waka. They're talking about platform leaping being a big part, naturally, and the locations being brilliant. Lots of detail. Another pic shows some cogs, with a warning not to get trapped in them. Or it's Goodnight Vienna, bit dramatic. Music-wise, it sounds like they're going for the classic Castlevania theme, with eerie choirs. They mention a scene with violin music and chanting monks, trying to create atmosphere, I suppose. The reviewer reckons the 3D camera gives you ample opportunity to ogle, which is a bit of a weird phrase, isn't it? There's a picture of Belmont in a grand-looking hall with a chandelier, so yeah, you can see what they mean about showing off the 3D. They compare parts of it to Super Castlevania 4 on the SNES, which is high praise indeed. That was a cracker. Chia. Overall, they seem pretty impressed with how it's looking, reckon it's tremendous, and we can expect a playable version in a couple of months. So yeah, Castlevania in 3D on the N64, it was something to look forward to back then. Let's be honest, it was a bit ropey when it actually came out, wasn't it? But hey, we were all excited at the time. This page is a preview for Turok 2, Seeds of Evil on the N64, looks like it's called Monster Squad. Ah yes, I remember the hype for this one back in '98. They're banging on about how amazing the graphics are, saying it's pushing the N64 harder than ever, which, to be fair, Turok did always look pretty decent. They've got some screenshots, showing off the weapons and monsters, raptors getting their heads blown off with a double-barreled shotgun. Classic Turok stuff, really. Seems like they're impressed with the level design, saying they are huge but easier to navigate than the first game, which was a bit of a maze sometimes, wasn't it? Paria. The reviewer mentions the weapons have been overhauled, and they name-drop the Magnum, shotgun, PFM layer, shredder, and flamethrower, all sounding suitably over the top. They even mention the tranquilizer, saying it's actually useful this time for accessing secret areas, which is a bit of a surprise. No one really used that thing in the first game, did they? Overall, it's your typical preview, really, getting you excited for the game, showing off the shiny new bits. Monster Squad, dramatic title for a bit of dino blasting fun. Looking forward to seeing the full review when it comes out, might be one to keep an eye on. This page is all about Rogue Squadron, or Shadow Blaster as they've called it here, for the N64. Seems like LucasArts are trying to make up for that Shadows of the Empire game, which, if I'm honest, was a bit of a mess, wasn't it? They mentioned that Shadows was only good for the snowspeed a bit, and it sounds like Rogue Squadron is trying to capture that kind of space battle feeling. They're saying you get to fly as Luke Skywalker himself, piloting X-Wings, Y-Wings, and all those other wing-type ships. Looking at the screenshots, they've definitely got the Star Wars look nailed, with the TIE fighters and explosions, all that good stuff. They're promising ground-based levels too, with places like Luke's farm and Jabba's fortress making an appearance, so that should be familiar to fans. The reviewer seems pretty impressed with the visuals and the sound, reckon you'll be able to tell where the TIE fighters are coming from, with a decent sound system, which sounds alright. They're saying it could be a proper good Star Wars game like the PC lot have been getting for ages, but it's early days yet, so we'll see if it lives up to the hype when it finally appears in the shops. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 20, in the Planet 64 section, is having a look at Glover. Remember that one from Hasbro? Due out in October apparently. They're calling it a platform puzzle game, which in '98 seemed to be the trend. The storyline's a bit madcap, isn't it? Senile wizard, magic gloves, one of them going rogue after falling in a cauldron and turning evil. Of course it does. And naturally, it's up to you, playing as the good Glover, to sort it all out and get these magic crystals. They're saying it's a mix of Mario 64 feat and Marble Madness. Quite the combination. Judging by these screenshots, the graphics are a bit of a mixed bag. One caption says about Glover being stuck in a deep pit, another mentions crazy golf entrances. Sounds a bit quirky, doesn't it? They're promising a proper review in the next issue, so we'll see what they really think then. This page is all about Fighting Force. Looks like Eidos are having a crack at the N64 market, though the bloke writing reckons it's no Tomb Raider, sadly for Lara Croft fans. Apparently, it's a beat-em-up like Final Fight, but they've souped up the graphics for the N64. Sounds like you'll be wading through levels filled with thugs and massive bosses, beating them up with punches, kicks, and whatever you can lay your hands on as a weapon. Bits of wood, pipes, the usual. They're banging on about how interactive everything is, smashing up the place, which is supposed to set it apart. They're talking about 4 characters you can play as, a girl called Alana, and then 3 blokes named Mace, Hawk and Smasher. Seems they are having a bit of a giggle about guessing which of the fellas might wear lipstick, bit cheeky that. Apparently they all have special moves and combos, and there's a fair bit of claret flying around, as you'd expect. Looks like they're aiming for a November release for Fighting Force, so we'll see if it's any good then. There's a screenshot of some dodgy looking geezer in blue, raising his fists, with the caption, "Blue bad guy raises his dukes for a little bit of fisticuffs. Shoot him dead." Charming. Another one shows a subway scene with a caption about it being safe to travel on the underground, and Hawk always carries insurance. Right then. This page then, right, it's all about the new Zelda game, Ocarina of Time. Remember all the buzz around this? They're showing us some new bits, this time it's Lon Lon Ranch. Looks like they're really pushing the horse riding, you know, galloping about, and horse races. There's this fella Ingo, sounds like a right miserable git, apparently Link has to beat him at the horse game. And Malon is there too, apparently Link is doing her a favor, bless. They also mention seeing a garden section at E3. Right at the bottom, a bit of a dig at Metal Gear Solid, cheeky. Everyone was waiting for Zelda, weren't they? December release? Hey, fingers crossed it's actually as good as they're making out, eh? This page is about Harvest Moon 64, blimey, farming on the N64, who would have thought it? Apparently, it was a hit on the SNES and Game Boy, something about cute characters and growing turnips, tending to your virtual cows and all that. This new version for the N64 is meant to be a bit of an upgrade, with different camera views and you can carry more tools, which sounds handy, instead of just lugging around two at a time. They're banging on about loads of animals and characters to chat to, even finding yourself a life partner, cheeky. And loads of different events in the game to keep you busy all year round, festivals for everything like New Year, seeds, flowers, fireworks, crops, cows, eggs, Thanksgiving, stars and even spirits. Corrington's quite the social calendar for a farmer, eh? Corrington. There's a bit about Zelda 64 as well. They're playtesting it next month in London at some game show, the ECTS. They'll be doing a full report in the next issue, can't wait for that to be honest. Zelda sounds a bit more my cup of tea than virtual farming. Apparently there's a new female character called Malon, and you do her a favor, although what that is exactly is anyone's guess, maybe helping her with her chickens or something. And it mentions Metal Gear Solid style stealth, hiding behind bushes, which sounds a bit bonkers for a Zelda game, but intriguing I suppose. Wait till the RSPCA get wind of Link lobbing chickens about, eh? Still, looks like there's plenty to keep us busy on the N64, from saving Hyrule to growing prize-winning pumpkins. Right then, cup of tea anyone? This page talks about speed, and it's kinda tying in with the release of F-Zero X. Reckon that game's gonna be a proper white-knuckle ride. Max Everingham's been in Japan apparently, and he's going on about how good Japan is at making fast stuff like Le Mans cars, F1, motorbikes and their bullet trains, or Shinkansen as they call them, which sounds a bit less exciting, doesn't it? Apparently, these trains are seriously quick and way better than driving in Japan because the traffic is a nightmare. He reckons Tokyo traffic is so bad it's quicker to walk. Bit dramatic maybe. Waiter. Then there's a bit about Mario's PhotoPie, this new cartridge thingy. Seems like you can use smart media cards with it, you know, from digital cameras. Remember those were still a bit newfangled back then. Looks like you could muck about with your photos on the N64, and make postcards. Japanese text and English too, fancy that. Says it'll work with the 64DD as well, if that ever actually comes out here. Price is about 9,800 yen. Screenshot shows Mario in some sort of digital photo studio set up on the telly screen. Looks a bit basic, doesn't it? But hey, for the N64 it's something different I suppose. Exclusive color prints, they say. Sounds like a bit of a gimmick, but maybe fun for a laugh. This page has got a bit of everything really. Typical magazine fodder back then. There's a piece talking about this Godzilla handheld game for the Game Boy. Apparently it's doing surprisingly well, even though it's supposed to be a bit pants. They're saying it's so popular they can't even keep it in stock, especially in cinemas showing the Godzilla film. Bit of a marketing time that, Billy. Then there's a review of this Konami game called Rakuga Kids. Some sort of crayon fighting thing. Famitsu in Japan didn't rate it that highly, gave it middling scores but said it was cute. You know, typical Japanese style. They reckon it's not going to be a Tekken 3 beta though, which is fair enough. That Tekken game was quite something at the time. There's a bit about a Pokemon Center opening in Tokyo too. Apparently they've got loads of merchandise, shirts, toys, the lot. Pocket Monsters was already massive then, wasn't it? Kids were going mad for it, so a dedicated shop makes sense I suppose. Teke. Down at the bottom, there's a piece about virtual reality. Tokyo University are apparently working on some fancy VR headset. They're even talking about smells and tastes being involved. Imagine playing Biohazard 3 with the smell of blood. Bit much that? And lastly, there's an article on these Busuzoku gangs in Japan, these reckless biker kids. Apparently, they ride around on their scooters causing a nuisance. They are talking about police and games like F-Zero X being about speed, linking it all together somehow. Oh, and a little learned Japanese bit with words about speed and driving, tied in with the biker gang thing I guess. So yeah, a random collection of bits and bobs. Pretty standard stuff for the time really. This page is about a special investigation into Wipeout 64 and ODT from Psygnosis. It seems the N64 Magazine lot went up to Liverpool, probably a train journey I expect, for an exclusive look at these games. It's talking about Wipeout 64 going up against F-Zero X, which was a big deal back then, Nintendo's own futuristic racer. Apparently Psygnosis weren't too worried. They reckoned Wipeout 64 was proper anti-gravity racing, unlike F-Zero X, which they thought was more traditional. And it's got weapons, of course. There's a quote from a producer called Andy Satterthwaite saying they've got better control in their game, and when you're using faster ships in Wipeout 64, it's comparable to F-Zero X. They also mention new scenery and tracks, 6 in total, which sounds decent. Apparently Wipeout 64 is a mix of Wipeout and Wipeout 2097 from the PlayStation, plus some extra bits. The development time was quite short, only 8 months, starting in February, and they expected it to be finished around the time this magazine was out. They've smoothed out some of the annoying things from Wipeout 2097, like bumping into walls and grinding to a halt, which was a pain. You can scrape along the side of corners now and get sparks, which sounds a bit more forgiving. But they also say it's very hard, so don't expect to breeze through it. There are some screenshots of the gameplay, showing the heads-up display with check times and lap records and your position. Looks pretty fast, proper Wipeout style. One of the screenshots mentions autopilot, which might be a power-up or something. It also mentions 4-player multiplayer being possible without needing link-up cables, like Wipeout 2097 on PlayStation, which is a bonus. 4 controller ports on the N64, remember them? Simpler times. Challenge mode is in there too. This page is all about Wipeout 64 on the N64. It's billed as a special investigation from N64 Magazine. Right in the middle you've got the massive Wipeout 64 inches logo in that really bold futuristic font they were using back then, yellow and blue. Very striking. They're saying it's faster, smoother, harder, slicker, better than previous Wipeouts, which is what you'd expect, isn't it? They were always trying to push the boat out. It mentions about sitting down and strapping in for a journey into the very nearly complete Wipeout 64. Bit of a weird phrase, very nearly complete, makes you wonder what's missing, eh? Perhaps they were just being clever and implying it's almost perfect. There's a bit about the music being utterly fantastic, and mentioning bands like the Propellerheads, Fluke, and some lesser-known lot called PC Music. They do admit it hasn't got as many bands as the PlayStation versions, but basically say who cares if the music is still good. Fair enough, I suppose. Music was a big part of Wipeout. Up at the top, there's a little red circle shouting about a free time and space magazine with a beginner's guide to Wipeout, which sounds like a decent freebie. You've also got these team logos scattered about: Vector, Phantom, Rapier, Venom, with names attached like Kyle's Bridge and Duranesbocana. All very futuristic and a bit made up sounding, but it fit the vibe. Down at the bottom right, it says October 1998, so this is when this magazine was out, and page 35. It also says, the UK release is November, and the USA release is also November. So, it's a preview pushing the game before it came out. Classic N64 magazine stuff really, getting you hyped for the latest game. This page is about Wipeout 64 on the N64, and it's previewing 2 tracks, Clysbridge and Coron IV. They're calling it Death Race 2098, which sounds a bit dramatic, doesn't it? Apparently it's supposed to be proper difficult, which for Wipeout, well, that's saying something, as they were never exactly a walk in the park on the PlayStation. Clysbridge is set in Greenland, and they say it's good for beginners to get to grips with the game. Long straights and easy corners apparently. Then there's Coron IV, which is set underwater. Looks a bit more interesting with its scenery, and they reckon it's better for top speed runs. They're making a point about how Wipeout 64 is different from F-Zero X, saying when you get hit, it's more like being zapped by an electrobolt, and you sort of crackle with energy, which sounds a bit more interesting than just spinning out like in F-Zero. There's also talk of a secret craft called Piranha, a follow-up to the one from Wipeout 2097, or Wipeout ZY, as we called it then. This new Piranha is supposed to be stealthy and undetectable by radar, and you can even go straight through other ships, which sounds a bit cheeky, doesn't it? Sneaky! We can't wait, they've put. Bit much enthusiasm for a gaming mag reviewer if you ask me. Down at the bottom they've got a pick that out section, which is all about weapons. There's a table showing rockets, missiles and mines, and their accuracy. It seems like some crafts are better with certain weapons than others, judging by the little crosses and dots on the grid. Looks like you need to get to grips with all of that if you want to be any good at it. This page is all about Wipeout 64. Blimey, feels like yesterday that came out. It's a special investigation thingy. They reckon if you thought the N64 Wipeout would be a bit easier, think again, especially on the Socana track. Apparently it's an absolute nightmare with lava. There are screenshots showing bits of the Socana track, numbered 1 through 6, showing off corners, and the lava, I guess. Then it moves on to Dyroness, saying it's initially easier but then gets tricky with nasty bends. Again, there are 6 numbered screenshots of Dyroness, showing off the green and brown track. There's a bit called Brains and Brawn about how good the AI is, saying the computer opponents are fantastic and aggressive, which is a good thing apparently for competition. They're saying to try the challenge mode and the silver and gold competitions, and you'll likely get thrashed by the computer players. Cheeky! Then there's a music to your ears section with the full track listing tunes by PC Music and Fluke, and the propeller heads. Tracks like Chasing Radium, Feel at Home, Monolith Boy, Tomorrow Reborn, Sonic Trip by PC Music, and then Absurd, Goodnight Lover by Fluke, and Bang On by the propeller heads. Apparently the Fluke track Absurd was used for Monday Night Football on Sky Sports, which is a bit of trivia. At the bottom, there's a section showing weapon grids for Electro Bolt, Quake Disruptor, Plasma Bolt, and Thunderbomb, showing a little grid diagram for each. Not gonna pretend I understand what that's all about just by looking at it. Seems to be some kind of move list or something. This page here is having a look at Wipeout 64, and this game called Death Race 2098. For Death Race it seems to be focusing on how tough the tracks are, mentioning places called TERAFUMOS and VELOCITAR. Apparently they're trickier than they look and full of bends that'll mess you up. Sounds like a bit of a challenge then. Tatey. Then it moves on to Wipeout 64. Reckon it's saying there's a secret extra track called VELOCITAR in that as well, and it's meant to be properly difficult and fast, especially if you're playing in Phantom class. They're also banging on about the multiplayer in Wipeout 64, saying it's better than the PlayStation Wipeout 2097, which never really had proper multiplayer. Good to know if you've got mates to play with in it. Tranny. It talks about the two-player mode being pretty much the same as single player, but when you get to 3 or 4 players, they've had to cut back on the backgrounds a bit to keep it speedy. Makes sense, I suppose, can't have it chugging. Still looks like it could be a laugh with a few mates round. And then down the bottom there's a bit about the power-ups in Wipeout. Autopilot, shields, turbo boost, EPAKS, the usual stuff you'd expect to find to give you an edge, or annoy your mates with. Yeah, standard Wipeout fare really. This page in N64 Magazine is diving deep into the challenge mode in Wipeout 64. Remember Wipeout 64? Yeah, on the N64, blurringly fast, proper pants-sweating stuff back then. They're calling this new mode Block Rockin' Beating, which, well, is a bit much, isn't it? They're banging on about 3 main challenge types: race, time trial, and weapons. Race challenge is your standard race against 15 crafty opponents, but split into 6 different objectives. Sounds like a bit of a faff having to do specific things like race in a Physar craft without weapons. Time trial is fairly obvious, beat the clock, and they're saying it's in 6 challenges too, bronze, silver and gold levels for each. Weapons challenge apparently is the hardest, having to destroy opponents within time limits set by checkpoints. Again, computer chooses your craft and weapons, bit controlling, aren't they? Then there's this cyclone challenge which you get after doing all those. Sounds like a secret thing. Apparently it makes every weapon you pick up twice as powerful, which, in Wipeout, is probably pure carnage. There's also a bit they've called Special Investigation Opinion, saying Wipeout 64 is fantastic, praising the speed and floaty crafts, and the analog stick control, comparing it to the PlayStation's old D-pads. Bit of a dig there. Then a plus, super weapons section, talking about special weapons for different teams. Physar get a minigun, only lasts 5 seconds, rapid fire, sounds a bit rubbish to be honest. AG Systems get a shield raider which nabs enemy shields and fires back energy. Oricom has an energy sphere, charge it up and it's a straight line destroyer, and Quirex gets a power snare which is like a mine that appears behind you. Sounds alright I suppose. They reckon the challenge mode is inspired and smooth and that Psygnosis's debut looks good. Expect a review soon, they say. Well, it's 1998, so I imagine the review came out a while back now. Oh, and a little box called The Devil's Work, moaning about loading times, saying, please wait. No, we will not wait. Bit dramatic, even for 1998. They're saying it's because the music takes up 25% of the cart, so that's why the small delays before each race. Explains it, I suppose. Underneath all that, a little logo saying FSODO, whoever they are, and please wait again, just to rub it in I guess. This page is a bit of a special investigation it seems for the N64, and it's all about a game called ODT. Looks quite interesting, a bit like a dungeon crawler type of thing from the screenshots. One picture shows some bloke getting zapped by electricity, another has a weird alien contraption, and there are a couple showing combat with beasties and some puzzle solving. Visually, it's alright, seems like they are saying it's better looking than the PlayStation version, which is always good for the N64, isn't it? ABU. Apparently the story is a bit of a bonkers sci-fi yarn about a planet called Tonantzin being wiped out by a disease, and you've got to find a green pearl to sort it out. You play as Captain Lamat and his crew who crash land in a place called the Forbidden Zone. Sounds like classic video game nonsense, which is probably right up my street. They're calling the size of ODT impressive, and reckon it's got 8 levels, each split into sectors, anything from 4 to 14 of them. They mention the Chaos Engine, which was a decent game back in the day on the Amiga and SNES. This ODT sounds like it's got some RPG bits in it too. You can pick characters with different strengths, and you level them up by exploring and fighting. Could be a decent time sink if it's any good. This page is having a proper look at ODT, which apparently is short for oddity over in France. Bit of an odd name for a game, alright, maybe lost in translation, eh? It's from Psygnosis, who are meant to be good with this motion capture stuff. They did that Adidas Power Soccer game, remember that one? Anyway, ODT is supposed to be a big game. 8 levels they reckon, and each level's broken down into sectors. Sounds a bit maze-like, doesn't it? They're saying each bit is massive, you can wander around, not just stuck on a set path, which is good. Each level's got its own monsters and puzzles and all that. Water levels have water puzzles, naturally. The testers were playing it for ages apparently. Must be a bit of depth to it then. They're banging on about how the N64 version is better than the PlayStation 1, smoothing out the blocky bits and all that, making it look nicer. And the controls are meant to be better on the N64 pad too, which is probably a good thing. They keep mentioning the motion capture, saying it helps make the characters move properly, like in the football game they did. Apparently speeds things up for the artists, which is always handy. There are a couple of screenshots showing it off. Looks a bit dark and moody, doesn't it? The main character seems a bit like a Lara Croft type, with a gun. Hopefully this ODT game will be a bit of alright when it finally turns up next spring. This page from N64 Magazine is having a look at a game called ODT. Looks like it's a bit of a party game for 4 players with characters that are all a bit different. It mentions that like most RPGs you get magic spells, and you can switch between your party members in battles, but here you only play as one of them at a time. Seems like the reason to replay it is to see how the story changes depending on who you pick, which sounds a bit interesting I suppose, a bit like getting your money's worth back then when games were pricey. They've got little profiles of the 4 characters: Ike Hawkins, who's a corporal, Julia Chase, who is a cartographer, Max Havoc, a chief engineer, and Solar, who is an archbishop. Each of them has a catchphrase, and ratings for armor, spirit, weapon control and experience. Looks like the usual stat stuff. Then there's a section called Braving the Elements, which seems to be about the different weapon types. There's light, fire, electric, fusion and grenade. Light is described as good for early levels and long range. Fire is good for crowd control and setting enemies alight in a death-style punishment. Electric is a powerful weapon that locks onto enemies. Fusion is the strongest, a nuclear weapon that blows everything up. And grenade is a corridor weapon for blowing up groups of enemies, especially to duck-like spiders. Sounds like a right mess. Each weapon section has a little screenshot of the weapon in action. They look alright for the time. A bit blocky mind, but it was the N64 days, wasn't it? This page in N64 Magazine is having a bit of a laugh at the enemy, AI in ODT, calling it artificial stupidity, or assess cheeky. Apparently, these enemies are meant to be dumb as often as they are clever. Which sounds a bit backhanded, doesn't it? They reckon the monsters are driven by anger, fear and hunger. If they get hurt, they might run off, or if they're hungry they'll eat their fallen mates instead of attacking you. They've got an arsenal of weapons though, so they aren't completely daft. Moving on, they talk about the number of enemies, apparently about 40 types, and they add 5 new ones each level. Level 1 has bats, baddies, grenades and gun turrets, then bosses like the golem. The refinery levels are full of robots, some flying, some unfinished. Vegetation levels have raptors and tree men. They've tied the enemy look to the level, which is fair enough I suppose. They are showing off motion capture, but admit they've mutated the bodies with extra limbs and stuff. Nice. Then there's a bit about bosses. First up, the golem, a level 2 boss on the roof. Apparently he's a big stone giant, slow but strong, and his weak spot is tricky to find. But you can outsmart him by moving around as he's slow to turn. Then there's the ice monster, faster than the golem, and likes to kick when you get close, draining your energy. Sneakiness and elemental weapons are the way to go, and being ice, water or fire weapons would be effective against him, you'd reckon. Finally they mention the meat cleaver, a traditional enemy, a fat bloke with cleavers who's a bit of a French oddity. He's got cleavers for hands, and apparently chops up organs in his kitchen before coming for you. He'll chase you around and toss his cleavers, making things difficult with platforms around. Lastly, they touch on magic, calling it spells like mean spirits. Magic is meant to be a big part of ODT, but it's not working fully yet in the preview build. You can collect potions but not use them yet. There will be 16 spells in total, with with 4 levels for each element: fire, earth, water, and air. Spells are real-time, not cutscenes like Final Fantasy V-2, thank goodness. They mention spells that will freeze enemies, make it rain, shield you, teleport you, make you invisible, or even turn you into a vampire. The vampire one sounds a bit different, I'll give them that. This page from N64 Magazine is doing a bit of a special investigation on some upcoming games. Tonic Trouble, Hype, and Scars it says at the top. Seems like Ubisoft, who were getting pretty big at the time, were showing off their wares. Apparently they went to Canada and London to have a look at Tonic Trouble and Scars. Tonic Trouble is clearly the main game they're focusing on here. They're talking about where it all happens, mentioning level names like Ski Slope, where Ed, the main bloke, is apparently sliding down a mountain. Then there's South Plain, which is like a hub world, Doc's Cave, Vegetable HQ, sounds a bit bonkers, and North Plain. Apparently there are 11 worlds, and a secret one if you're a completionist and find all the hidden bits. There are a few screenshots dotted about. One shows Ed getting menaced by a trident, described as nasty. Fair enough, tridents are a bit nasty. Another shows him gliding around on his bow tie. They're saying it's a bit like Banjo-Kazooie, that was all the rage then, wasn't it? Another screenshot they've captioned, Smug Grin, Deranged Gorp, talking about Ed being an alien of many faces, whatever that means. They're also making a joke about scary vegetables, calling them sprouts, lettuces and cauliflowers, and saying Ubisoft are having a scary time in the grocers. Bit of a dad joke that, eh? They mention the UK and US release being in November, so this must have been getting ready for Christmas. Looks like a pretty standard platformer for the N64 to be honest, colourful, and a bit daft. Probably worth a rent from Blockbuster back in the day. This page is about Tonic Trouble, yeah, the Ubisoft game. Right then, so the story is about this alien fella called Ed who's a bit clumsy and drops a can of toxic waste on Earth. Naturally this turns all sorts of things, especially vegetables, into absolute menaces. Killer veg from France apparently. Charming. Ed's gotta sort it out and get the tonic back. It's a 3D platformer, typical of the time. They mention issue 9 way back when, so it's been in development for a while. Seems like they moved development from Paris to Montreal. Gameplay-wise, Ed's got the usual running and jumping lark, but also a sidestep, hanging from platforms, swimming, and a glide like in Banjo-Kazooie, which was the big platformer back then, wasn't it? He's got a magic stick for attacks, which also doubles as a pogo stick, and can lever things about. They're saying the graphics are sharp, Silicon Valley style, whatever that really means in practice, but it's probably a good thing. Level-wise, they've got names like Canyon, Pyramid, Steam Cooker, Grog's Kingdom, and Crazy Tower. Standard platforming fare really. Pyramid level is supposed to be more puzzles than fighting. Steam Cooker's set in Grog's factory, and Grog's Kingdom is nearing the end, naturally. There's even a bonus system, but you'll need to backtrack to get everything because Ed learns new moves later on, which sounds like a bit of a chore if you ask me, but completionists probably lapped that up. Looks like it was slated for a November release back in '98, so right in time for Christmas. Overall, seems alright. Not exactly setting the world on fire, but looked like a decent platformer to tide us over. This page in N64 Magazine, issue 20, is under the banner of Special Investigation, and it's delving into a few titles. We've got Tonic Trouble, Scars, and the main focus seems to be on Hype, the time quest. Hype is slapped across the page, with the tagline suggesting it's about a toy on a mission. Ubisoft are behind this one, slated for release early in '99 on the N64, both here and in the States. They've even given it a number 1, so it must be their game of the month or something. You know how these mags are. The screenshots, well, they've come clean and said they're from the PC version. Bit of a liberty, but there you go. Gameplay-wise, looks like your typical 3D action platformer. Dodging knives, arrows flying, casting fire spells, funny orange fire stuff according to them. Ghost enemies you have to jump to hit. Classic stuff. They've even got a wizard in there who apparently looks like Playmobil, bless them. And a trip to the blacksmith for nails. Perhaps a touch of item management or something. There's even a caption saying they're suspicious about one screenshot, but Ubisoft has assured them. Very mysterious. So yeah, Hype, the time quest. Looks like it could be a laugh. We'll see if it lives up to it when it actually arrives. This page in the magazine is having a look at Time Quest, a game based on Playmobil for the N64. Bit of a surprise that, wasn't it? Apparently it's a hack-and-slash adventure game. They're calling it Tomfoolery in a Playmobil style, which sounds about right. There's going to be 13 levels of this, and they mention puzzles with coloured floor tiles. Very original. The screenshots show the usual kind of thing you'd expect. Sword fighting, dragon riding, and even a boss who looks like a rather rotund monk. It was in development at Ubisoft Montreal for both the PC and N64. They're talking about how they've made it look properly Playmobil, with the plastic look and all, elbows and knees sticking out, which is a choice I suppose. They mention fighting skeletons, ghosts, the usual suspects. They were aiming for a Playmobil feel, and it was supposed to be out around Easter the next year. October 98 this magazine is, so a bit of a wait back then. This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at Scars. It seems to be a futuristic motor racing game. Proper rough and tumble stuff from the screenshots. They reckon the cars look like sharks on wheels. Or maybe tuna. Bit of a weird comparison if you ask me. Looks like they are on a snow level in one of the shots, and another one seems to be in a desert, so a bit of variety there at least. One of the captions mentions it's like Freezy Peak from Banjo-Kazooie, and that these cars would have made that level a bit easier, which is probably true. Those snowmen were a pain. Another bit says holding the trigger down powers up your weapons. Kaboom! They put. Bit dramatic. Apparently the Mantis car is in 6th place in one of the screenshots, and they are saying it's a tough game to win, because the computer cars are independently calculated, whatever that means. Sounds like they are just saying it's hard. The box at the bottom says it's by Ubisoft and coming out in October, both here in the UK and in the USA, for 1 to 4 players. Looks like your typical N64 racer really, probably another one to add to the pile. This page is having a look at a game called SCARS, which stands for Situational Combat, Animal Recycled Simulation. Blimey, that's a mouthful, isn't it? It seems to be trying to muscle in on the kart racing scene. You know, like your Mario Kart and Street Racer type of games. They reckon it's got that classic power-up fueled racing that we all loved back then. The screenshots show it in action, and it's got this thing where you can see all 4 players on screen at once. Which was a bit of a novelty, though sometimes it could get a bit hectic trying to keep track of everything. Apparently you can blow your mates off the side of a mountain, which sounds right up my street. They also mention missiles and electric barriers, so sounds like they've thrown in a bit of everything. The reviewer reckons it's got that kind of frantic power-up racing we were used to from Mario Kart, so they're not shy about making comparisons. They mention unlocking tracks and cars, and that the computer races are supposed to be challenging but not unfair, which we'll see about that, won't we? They also mention that the computer players make mistakes just like humans, which was always the aim, wasn't it? Haku. Over on the side there's a bit called Completely LAA, which is a bit of a laugh about writing computer games versus programming them, playing on the old stereotype of programmers just surfing the net all day. And at the bottom there's a picture of some people, probably the magazine staff or something. Anyway, Scars could be a laugh if you're into your kart races. This page then, it's a look at Scars, which is trying to muscle in on the kart racing scene, but they're saying it's a bit more serious than your average karting game, more like Mario Kart but technically generations ahead apparently. They mention missiles and power-ups, all the usual weapon stuff you'd expect, like dropping mines and the like. Apparently you can even look behind you to see if you're about to get a missile up your exhaust, which is handy. And they've got headlights on the cars, proper dipped and full beam, for racing at night or in the snow and rain, all that. Fancy. Graphically they're proper chuffed with it, saying it's got loads of detail and minimal drawing, which back then was always the holy grail, wasn't it? Photorealistic they're calling it, especially with the particle effects. A bit much maybe, but I suppose we were easily impressed back then. There's a bit where they're wondering how Vivid Image managed to get so much detail in without loads of texture tiling. They reckon they used over 600 textures on each track, which sounds a bit bonkers for the N64, squeezing it all onto a standard cartridge. Curiouser and curiouser, as they say. Right at the bottom they're comparing it to F-Zero X and Wipeout, proper heavy hitters at the time. They reckon Ubisoft are confident Scars is different enough to do its own thing. We'll see about that, won't we? Full review in October apparently. Sounds like they're quietly impressed but trying not to get too carried away just yet. This page of N64 Arena, right, it's got a bit of everything. Up top there's IS98, which was International Superstar Soccer, proper footy game on the N64, supposed to be the best in the world. Bit of a boast there. Then there's Biofreaks, one of those beat-em-ups, probably a bit violent for some. Blood Spillage Paul style, it says, which is a laugh. And then F1 World Grand Prix, the racing game, they're calling it the greatest on the N64. Bit strong maybe. Down below they've got their guide to scoring, explaining how they mark games. Apparently they're strict, and don't just give out top scores. 85% and above gets a star game badge, meaning it's really good, a proper top tier game. 84% to 70% is still top-notch, good fun, worth getting. 69% to 50% is okay, playable, but maybe nothing special, doesn't really use the N64 well, they reckon. 49% to 20% is getting into the dodgy territory, lazily programmed, hurried together, or just a bad idea. And then 19% to 0%, that's the disaster zone, avoid those completely. Fair enough scoring system, I suppose, keeps things honest. This page is all about the import scene on the N64, games that might be a bit harder to get hold of over here in Blighty, back in '98. We've got a rundown of a bunch of titles. First up, Mortal Kombat 4 apparently ripping arms. MK goes PAL. Sounds like they're finally bringing the proper version over here, no doubt more pixelated gore. Then there's Cruisin' World, which they're not too impressed with, calling it not really very good. Ouch. Chopper Attack gets a mention saying it's tweaked, changed, reviewed. Always tweaking things, aren't they? Buck Bumble is there too. Bzz. Insects Go to War. Remember that one? A bit quirky, that. Then it dives into Import Arena proper, with Rakuga Kids taking center stage, apparently the weirdest beat-em-up ever. Sounds intriguing, I guess. YLA Country Club is described as, golf comes to the good old US, what's it like? Ooh, probably a bit like golf, but American. Bomberman B-Damon, another Bomberman game, another dud. Sarcastic, I like it. Choro Q is, Micro Machinist-style racing turns up in Japan. Micro Machines on the N64, sounds like a laugh. And finally, Super Robot Spirits, anime robots battle it out. Sedately. Sedately? Not sure about that, Dady. There's a how it works bit, explaining their review scores. Visuals, sounds, mastery, lifespan, and then the verdict. Pretty standard stuff for a games mag, innit? Then we've got Team 64 Inches giving their thoughts on Rakuga Kids. James Ashton is apparently too busy with Pizza Hut to talk about it, and his game of the month is F1 Grand Prix. Paul Jarrell thinks Rakuga might be some secret potion for winning games. His game of the month is Cruisin' World, bit controversial after slagging it off earlier. Will Overton is having a bit of a dramatic time involving a haircut and the police. His game of the month is PM Stadium. Tim Weaver is being a bit cheeky, saying Kiss My Rakuga. And his game of the month is Wipeout 64. Martin Kitts is doing a bit of a comedy silence act about Rakuga. And his game of the month is Silicon Valley. Andrea Ball, who claims to be the prod ed, reckons Rakuga means stink. Game of the month is Rakuga Kids, so maybe she likes stink. Jess Bickham reckons Rakuga means aqua in some weird way, and his game of the month is Buck Bumble. Finally, James Price says Rakuga means graffiti, very sensible, and his game of the month is also Buck Bumble. So there you have it, a mixed bag of import games, and the team's ramblings about what Rakuga might mean. Seems like they're having a laugh anyway. This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at International Superstar Soccer 98. Right then, IS-98. It says here, previously in N64 they reviewed the Japanese version, JIKU World Soccer, back in issue 18, so a bit of history for you. Seems like they're saying it was a bit obvious this game was coming out with all the football fever around, World Cup 98 and all that. They reckon the original ISS-64 was already top-notch, a proper footballing game, and they were wondering if they even needed to mess with it. Apparently at first glance it didn't seem like much had changed from the Japanese version, JIKU World Soccer, and maybe it was a bit disappointing initially. But they go on to say that the more they played IS-98, the more they noticed little tweaks and improvements. They're saying it actually does feel like a step up from the first game. The next few pages, they say, are going to give a proper rundown of what's new. There are some screenshots, one of a match in progress, looks like Argentina playing, player called C. Lopes, and they're winning 10. Another shot showing some tactics options like defensive and CNTRATCK, fairly standard footy game stuff really. Down at the bottom there's an info box about ISS-98. Konami are the publisher as expected. Says it's out in Sept, needs a controller pack, 118 pages. Probably the magazine size, not game manual pages cartridge, and 50 quid. Blimey, games were pricey back then, weren't they? At long last, the sequel to the Pele of football games. Bit much, isn't it? But ISS was always decent. This page is all about International Superstar Soccer 98, or IS-98 as it's called here, on the N64. It's delving into the new moves and tweaks they've added to the game since the previous ISS-64, JIKU. They're going through the different types of moves. First up, through ball, which they say is improved with a hold and run feature, making it easier to get those passes right. Then there's headers, which apparently were a bit rubbish in the old game, but now the players are leaping about like salmon and heading the ball properly. More realistic apparently. Curve shots are mentioned, saying they were a bit clunky before, but now you can bend it like Beckham, well, almost. Overhead kick is another one, apparently they weren't that common before, but now you can score spectacular bicycle kicks more often. Lobs are better controlled apparently, for those delicate chips or hoofing it clear. And finally, angles, where you don't have to be perfectly lined up to pass anymore, giving you a wider range of play. There's a bit titled Been There Done That, which is about the animations in ISS-64. They reckon it had loads of animation for the time, motion captured and all that. Apparently there were loads of celebrations, and they even mentioned seeing the Joey from Friends Commando Stride celebration, which is a bit of a laugh. They say N64 keeps all the good animations, and adds even more new tricks and touches. The reviewer seems to think that if you liked N64, you'll be right at home with N98. The controls are the same, players look the same, moves and tactics are familiar, but they also reckon there are enough changes to make it feel fresh and improved, not just a rehash. They mention new menu screens and options, and that you might need a bit of time to explore it all. They say close passing, dribbling and South American skills were good in the original, but crosses, set pieces, chips, headers and volleys are now better in 98. They end by saying N98 lets you do all the things from the original, but just a bit better. Sounds like a decent upgrade then. This page in N64 Magazine is all about International Superstar Soccer 98, or IS-98 as we called it back then. Remember that? Big football game for the N64. Warrington Knight. First up in the gameplay section, they're talking about player changes, using the right shoulder button to do it manually, stopping those annoying auto switches. And they mention the keeper rule, the 5 or 6 second handling thing. Seems Konami were taking that seriously for this one. Then there's cameras, a classic debate in footy games. Side view, overhead, the Super Soccer style one. They seem to be leaning towards the angled view, but admit the close-up vertical one makes the players look the bee's knees, visually anyway. Roger. Free kicks get a section too. Sounds like they've tweaked the arrows, split them for height and direction, makes aiming easier, which is a bonus. Walls are mentioned, using Z to jump, important for stopping those sneaky free kicks. And you can even change your free kick taker with Z, choose your foot with the C buttons, and change set plays with bottom C. Bit more to think about than just hoofing it. There's a bit called mastery, talking about wing play, opening up space down the flanks instead of just bombing forward all the time, spreading the play with long balls, proper football tactics, not just run and gun. Apparently they've made the player a bit less mental, not just headless chickens running around. Finally, there's a bit about the commentary. Tony Gubber is the new voice apparently, match of the day fame and all that, but it doesn't sound like the reviewer is too impressed, reckons it's repetitive and clueless, even suggests turning it off. Commentary in games, always a bit of a gamble whether it's any good or just annoying. This page of the magazine is all about the management side of the new International Superstar Soccer 98. Right then, formations, it mentions loads of presets, from the good old 442 to something mental like 145. Sounds a bit bonkers that. They say you can tweak them about a fair bit, which is good, because sometimes those preset things are a bit naff. Tactics, now there's 16 of those, which sounds like a step up from the old game. Apparently they actually work properly, which is a bonus. Motivation is a thing now too, you gotta keep your players happy. Little boxes next to their names change color. Green good, red bad. Don't let it go red too much, or you might get the sack. Bit harsh if you ask me, it's only a game. Marking is in there. Set players to mark in blocks or man-to-man, good for shutting down those fancy Dan players and closing down space. Team editing, well you can mess about with player height, preferred foot, and all that jazz. Skills are in too, dribbling, shooting, tackling, all that stuff affects how well they play. And scenarios, 16 of them, based on real games. Switzerland coming back from 30 down against Norway. Sounds like a laugh. The reviewer reckons it's worth £50 of anyone's money if they own the old ISS-64, says you'll find loads to keep you going. Might not blow you away like the first game did, but still reckons it's the best football game in the world. Bit strong maybe, but there you go. They do go on a bit about how much better the through balls are now and how the players are smarter at getting offside. Sounds alright I suppose. They're clearly trying to sell it, aren't they? But fair play, IS was always a decent footy game back then. This page in N64 Magazine writes, it's all about the animations in ISS-98. Remember ISS? Proper football game back then on the N64. Warrington Dorcas. So, animations, yeah. Apparently there are loads of celebrations. They're saying you get the Alan Shearer arm raise, knee slides, even a Klinsmann dive, bit much if you ask me, and a friendly head noogie when you win on pens. They call it ouch, no knuckles. Sounds a bit daft, doesn't it? Then there's the arguments bit. Seems like the players in IS-98 are right divas, always moaning at the ref, especially if they think they've been fouled. They have to be held back by their teammates. Never actually get a second yellow for mouthing off though, apparently. Officials are present and correct in their FIFA kits, doing little arm signals for free kicks and all that. Players themselves move much the same as before, but with a few extra bits, which is fair enough. The keepers get a mention for waving their arms about on the line during penalties. Medics section, this is funny. If a player gets a knock bad enough, they reckon he'll hobble off like Gaza back in the day, get the magic sponge treatment and then just carry on. If it's really bad, They get stretchered off with an intravenous morphine drip. Dramatic stuff for a football game. Replays are getting a bit of love, shown twice from different angles. You can spin the camera around now, which they say is smoother than the original game. Gee. Scares M to death section reckons N98 is faster than the last one. Not so fast that players look like cyclists apparently, but faster. They're harking back to kickoff and sensible soccer, saying gamers today have it easy on their eyes, compared to those days of unstoppable jet-powered blobs. Bit of a stretch maybe. Down the side they've got these little ratings. Visuals get a 9 for a veritable 30-yard thunderbolt. Sounds get an 8, something about close control and slotting it under the keeper. Mastery gets a 9, saying it's Ole football territory. And lifespan gets a 9-2, can't shake this lad off the ball. Warrington null. Verdict is fantasy dream team, with Pele, Cruyff, Maradona and Best on the bench. Bit over the top. They've slapped a whopping 92% on it. Must be alright then, eh? October 98, yeah, good times. This page in N64 Mag is having a look at Biofreaks, a new beat-em-up on the N64. They'd looked at the American version before in issue 18 and gave it 76%, so they're revisiting it. Apparently it's just been released over here. The reviewer reckons it's a decent beat-em-up for the N64, which is a bit of a backhanded compliment, isn't it? They say it's not exactly breaking news, but it's alright. Seems like they think it's another one trying to be like Mortal Kombat, but not quite getting there. They mention the fatalities are a bit of a laugh. Limbs and heads coming off and all that. There's a table here showing some of the fatality moves for different characters like Minatek, Sapo, Cyclown, Sabotage, Bullseye and Delta. Things like head spit and cut in half, you get the idea. Visually, they've given it an 8 out of 10, saying it's really very good, in a gloomy sort of way. Sounds about right for the time. Lots of dark and moody graphics were in fashion back then. Sound gets a 6, grunts and screams, and alright tunes. Mastery is a 7, and lifespan also a 7. Which suggests it's alright for a bit but maybe not got much staying power. D. There are some screenshots showing the game in action. One's got a bit of an explosion, another with some blood, and another showing a character winning. They've put little captions under them like, lovely explosion effect, we're sure you'll agree, and the blood's not bad either. Typical magazine humor. They also comment on the backgrounds, being a bit jazzy, but not great, and remark on the camera being a bit too far away. Verdict overall is 76%. Fun for a while but not a long-term prospect. So yeah, sounds like a rental at best. Still, could be a laugh with a mate for an evening, especially if you're into that sort of over-the-top violence. They finish off by saying, come on Capcom, what are you waiting for? Which is a bit random, maybe they wanted Capcom to make a better beat-em-up, who knows. This page is all about F1 World Grand Prix for the N64. They seem pretty impressed, reckon it's the best Formula 1 sim you'll ever get your hands on. A bold claim, eh? They're going on about how 6 months ago they were wondering if the N64 would even get a decent racing game, you know, mentioning Top Gear and San Francisco Rush. They were alright, weren't they? But nothing to write home about. But now, with Wipeout Xi coming later, and this F1 game landing, things are looking up. They're saying it's like Paradigm getting back to their best, like with Pilot Wings, and that it's technically really good with no pop-up, which was always a bit of a pain back then. Apparently it's packed with detail and is a proper dream for F1 fans. Though they do say not everyone will like it, a slightly odd thing to put in a review, isn't it? Looks like it's out now, takes up 96 meg, needs a controller pack, and maybe a rumble pack, for 50 quid. And there are a few screenshots of the game showing some racing action, and the in-game menus. They even point out Panis having a bit of a Monaco moment, and Alessi trying to catch Schumacher at the A1 ring. This page in N64 Mag is all about the new F1 World Grand Prix game, looking at the different ways you can play it. They're saying it's got loads of options, which is good, makes it more than just your average racer, apparently. Worry. First up there's Exhibition Mode, which is basically jump in and race on any of the circuits. Then there's Time Trial, classic stuff. Racing against your ghost to shave off those vital tenths. Challenge Mode sounds a bit different, putting you in scenarios from the 97 season, offensive, defensive, and dealing with car problems, which could be interesting. 2-player is there, split screen of course, but they reckon you both need to be about the same skill level to actually enjoy it. Fair enough, I suppose. The main one is Grand Prix Mode. The full shebang practice, qualifying, the race itself, proper long haul like a real race weekend. They reckon races can be anything from a short 4 laps, up to a full 200-mile distance. So you can really get stuck in. Then there's a bit where they say you can pick your own settings, like 97 events to make it more like the real season, racing line to show you the best path around the track, damage, which makes the computer cars a bit tougher even with it switched on, pit in for pit stop strategies, flags and weather, just sunny or rainy though, nothing too fancy, and laps where you can set race length. The bottom half of the page is all about steering wheels. They're saying F1 is actually better played with a wheel, which is a bit of a surprise considering Mario Kart and Diddy Kong Racing were out not long before, and pads were fine for those. They've reviewed a bunch of wheels. There's the V3 racing wheel from Interact. They say it's got pretty good steering, but the pedals are a bit weak, and no gear paddles. Then the race leader 64 feet from Guillemot. Apparently the best steering, gear paddles for F1 style changes, but the foot pedals are also weak. Next is the LX4 with rumble effect. Rumble is always a bit of a gimmick, isn't it? They say the rumble is brilliant, but the steering spring makes control tricky. Only one gear paddle, but good pedals. The ASC2 racing wheel is budget friendly, but they reckon the lack of proper pedals and gear paddles kind of defeats the point of realism. The Top Gear steering wheel by Logic, they call it the flashman of the group. Nice controls but no gear levers like F1 cars use, pedals are weak again. Finally there's a Jordan racing wheel by Joytech coming soon, developed with Eddie Jordan's team. They haven't tried it yet but reckon it could be the best for F1, so it's a bit of a mixed bag on the wheels then, some better than others but none sound totally perfect. This page delves into the world of the 1997 Formula 1 World Championship game for the N64, back when we were all still trying to figure out if 3D was actually any good or just a fad. It's all about Silverstone here, the British Grand Prix, 5.4 kilometers and a whopping 59 laps. Crikey, they've broken down the Silverstone track corner by corner, giving you tips for each one, like Albert Park in Australia, which is round 1, apparently quite a corker of a bend. Then there's Club Corner, sounds like a night out, but apparently it's a hard corner to get right. And Farm, which is before a hairpin, you should be doing about 70 miles per hour. They've got the Vale, Stowe, Chapel, and the Hangar Straight, all classic Silverstone corners. For Vale you should be in 6th gear hitting 160 miles per hour. Blimey, that's nippy. Hangar Straight, pedal to the metal, 185 miles per hour, in 7th gear if you've got the right setup. They also touch on other tracks in the game, like Belgium Spa-Francorchamps, saying it's got some public roads which sounds a bit dodgy for an F1 race if you ask me, and Italy Monza, the real deal for Italian fans. Then Austria A1 Ring, strangely out of sequence, and Japan Suzuka, famous for crashes apparently. Luxembourg Nürburgring is mentioned, even though it's in Germany, bit cheeky that. And finally round 17 Europe, Jerez, they weren't even sure if it was going to happen in 98, typical. So yeah, it's a bit of a track guide for the F1 game, back when polygon counts were low, and our expectations were even lower, but we still loved it, didn't we? This page is all about F1 World Grand Prix on the N64, yeah, that old chestnut. Looking back, it's a spread from an old mag, isn't it? Probably from around 98, I reckon. It's going through all the circuits in the game, bit by bit, like a track guide for dummies, really. They start with Brazil, Interlagos, Senna's home track, bit of trivia about the steering arm braking, remember that? Then on to Argentina, Buenos Aires, apparently a fast circuit but with some tricky corners to watch out for. San Marino, Imola, up next, little nation state in Italy apparently, who knew? Monaco, Monte Carlo of course, most famous Grand Prix they reckon, and definitely bonkers tricky on the telly, never mind in a game with N64 graphics. Spain, Barcelona, gets a mention for unpredictable weather spot on there, British summers are more reliable. Canada, Montreal, described as crash-friendly, which is probably putting it mildly if you remember some of the real races there. France, Magny-Cours, bit of countryside, Schumacher's favourite apparently, bet he liked winning there. And then Britain's Silverstone, home Grand Prix for most of the teams, McLaren, Williams, Jordan, Benetton, Arrows and Tyrrell, all just down the road from the track. Germany, Hockenheim, like a German Autobahn, no limits, sounds about right, doesn't it? Finally, Hungary, Hungaroring, slow circuit, narrow for overtaking, always a bit of a bore on telly, even more so in a game maybe. Each circuit bit has a little screenshot of the game, and some tips on speed and gear for certain corners, helpful enough I suppose if you were struggling to get around Silverstone without binning it on cops. Good times, eh? N64 F1, simpler days. This page in N64 Mag, issue 20, yeah, I remember this one. It's all about F1 World Grand Prix on the N64. Blimey, we waited ages for a proper Formula 1 game on the 64, and this one, well, it looked the business, didn't it? They're going through a race week scenario here, like a little guide. Starts off saying, your race weekend kicks off on Friday with practice laps, 10 of them in fact, to get the hang of the circuit. Then it's all about fiddling with your car settings on the paddock, computer, fuel, tyres, wing angles, the whole shebang. Apparently, Friday and Saturday practice sessions are key to learning the track and getting your car just right. Makes sense, doesn't it? Tyre. They're banging on about Suzuka being a fast circuit and Hockenheim needing a deep wing setting, typical racing game stuff. Then it's fuel and tyre strategies for a full Grand Prix. More fuel means less top speed, but fewer pit stops, you know the drill. Qualifying laps are timed and compared to other drivers. Getting serious now. The reviewer reckons by qualifying you should be happy with your car setup, aiming for the fastest lap with minimum fuel. Visually they are really hyping it up, saying the 17 Grand Prix look exactly like real life. Stunningly realistic, they say, showing off Monaco's hills in the background, and mentioning places like Magny Cours and Silverstone. Bit much maybe, but it did look pretty good for the time, I suppose. They are making a point about it being a proper simulation, not some arcade racer, needing skill and patience. 7 gears, no reverse, braking from 198 miles per hour to 60 miles per hour in 3 seconds. Sounds like a challenge, alright. Basically it's not for casuals apparently, it wants to teach you things. So yeah, F1 World Grand Prix, it was supposed to be the real deal for N64 racing fans back then. The next page in the mag is all about F1 World Grand Prix on the N64, looks like a review. Right at the top it says, Formula 1 racing is not easy, no kidding. They're going on about 7 gears and braking power, which is fair enough for an F1 game. Warringer. They've broken the review down into sections like visuals, which they've given a 9, saying it's stunning and amazing accuracy. Remember back then, polygon graphics were still quite new and impressive, especially on the N64. They mention occasional dropped frames forgivable. Yeah, we were used to that. Sounds gets a 7, fine but limited music apparently, which sounds about right for a racing game of that era. Then there's Mastery, a 10. They're really hyping it as the racing game the N64 deserves, and saying it thrashes the PlayStation version. Bit strong maybe. Lifespan gets a 9, reckon there are 18 tracks and a big difficulty curve. Sounds like they're saying there's a lot to get your teeth into. The screenshots show the game in action, with the cars racing on track. One bit of text beneath a screenshot mentions Eddie Irvine getting confused by the lack of cars to collide with, and Heinz Harald taking a trip to the sand and getting sacked by Frank Williams. Bit of real-world F1 flavor thrown in there. The verdict at the bottom is a massive 93%, calling it the finest driving simulation the world has ever seen. Bit much, isn't it? But hey, back then, it probably did look pretty amazing compared to what else was around on consoles. It's got a Stargame logo as well, so they clearly liked it a lot. Yeah, F1 World Grand Prix, I remember that, it was alright, wasn't it? This page in N64 Magazine seems to be giving the once-over to Mortal Kombat 4. Right at the top it mentions they reviewed the Japanese version of Mortal Kombat 4 in issue 18, so this is probably a follow-up now that the proper version is out. The headline screams, thwack, squelch, arg, which is pretty much what you'd expect from Mortal Kombat really, isn't it? The reviewer is saying it's a nasty business, and more gory than a weekly knitting circle meeting. Bit of a funny image that. There are screenshots dotted around with little comments boxes. One highlights the generic punch in the chops, still being a fan favorite. Another points out the backdrops are nice, but hardly awe-inspiring, which sounds about right for early 3D fighters. Didn't always age the best visually. They mention throw moves being easy, maybe too easy. Est visual. Someone called Scorpion gets a shout out for an off-the-shoulder look, and there's a screenshot showing a fatality with Kai wins, and fatality splattered across the screen. Nice and subtle as ever. Another comment is about how strange it is that the energy bars fill up, and they also mention Scorpion being one of the best fighters, despite his age. Down at the bottom there's a box called Mortal Kombat 4 inches, giving it a GT rating and a score of 96M, whatever that means. It says out now and £55, which was a fair whack back then for a game. Controller pack is mentioned, which you needed for saves and stuff, and rumble pack, which was the must-have to feel every punch in your hands. Controller pack 8 pages is listed too, maybe a separate guide in the mag for it. The main text rambles on a bit about how Mortal Kombat was supposed to be this intelligent game for self-confessed software intelligentsia. Bit posh for a game about ripping spines out, eh? It reckons Capcom's Street Fighter games had more depth, balance and control, and that Mortal Kombat lacked subtlety, which is definitely true. But then it says the fatalities are genius, even if it was rather too simple to see them all. A bit of a backhanded compliment there. They say the series got worse visually with each game, and didn't improve much gameplay-wise, but then call Mortal Kombat 4 pleasantly good. Not a classic, but enjoyable, and often hilarious slice of retro-style beat-em-up action. They reckon if you've played any Mortal Kombat game you'll know exactly how to handle this one, which is probably spot on. Sounds like a typical Mortal Kombat game then, good for a laugh with your mates but maybe not winning any awards for deep gameplay. This page covers Mortal Kombat 4, looks like a review in N64 Magazine. They're going on about the new weapon system in the game, calling it Sword and Goressery, which is a bit of alright wordplay. Apparently you can pick up weapons and smack people with them, and it's all very bloody, classic Mortal Kombat really. They mention it's a nod to games like Mace and Soul Blade, which were also kicking about at the time with weapons. There's a bit of a history lesson in there, reminiscing about the original Mortal Kombat on the SNES and Mega Drive. Apparently Nintendo asked them to tone down the fatalities back in the day, which caused a bit of a fuss with the older fans who liked the gore of the arcade original. Magazines slated it, and Sega probably had a right chuckle, they reckon. Looks like they're saying Mortal Kombat 4 is easy enough to pick up and play, not like some of these complicated modern fighters. They think the fatalities, ironically, are still the most complex moves, even though they seem simple compared to today's combo-heavy games. They've given it scores for visuals, sounds, mastery and lifespan, all hovering around the 8 mark except mastery, which got a 6. Overall verdict is an 84%, calling it a tidy little fighter and super bloody and super amusing. Sounds about right for the time, good solid score. They seem quite pleased with it, saying it's a pleasant surprise. James Price is the reviewer, apparently. Yeah, Mortal Kombat 4 was alright, not the best in the series, but certainly a decent brawler for the N64 at the time. This page is an absolute blast from the past, isn't it? It's a review for Cruisin' World on the N64, remember that one? Apparently they previewed it way back in issue 11, so this is the full verdict. Right then, Cruisin' World. The reviewer, Tim Weaver, is clearly not holding back. You're still, cruisin', but now it's the world's turn to get it. Bit cheeky. He goes on about how awful the proper screen is in Cruisin' World, and the title is just rubbish. He's not a fan of the map either, calling it a strangely serrated map of the Earth, linked to the worst theme song ever. Ouch. He even brings up those bodyform adverts, remember them? Now that's dating it, hear ya. They've given it scores, proper old school style. Down the side. Visuals get a 6, okay-ish, apparently better than Cruisin' USA, but with a strange grey glow. Sounds get a shocking 1. Another appalling rabble of ditties from the devil's own sound system. Blimey. Mastery is a 4, saying the fastest car looks sluggish. Lifespan gets another 1. Half an hour, if you're an average games player. And the verdict? Destined for life in the N64 scrapyard are done. Cruisin' World is dross of the highest order. Strong words. Overall score, a measly 38%. Not good, is it? Looking at the screenshots, there's one in Mexico with text bubbles. Mexico. Brum, brum, 129 miles per hour, and you won't be able to tell. And the Great Wall of China. Oh, of course. Sarcastic again. Typical N64 Magazine. Another one in the Bronx. Pelting it through the Bronx. In a flat yellow car. Please make it stop. And another about a tank jeep providing thrills aplenty. Allegedly. And then there's one on the moon. Racing on the moon in extra track extravaganza. Of course, racing on the moon is the same as racing on Earth. Just a bit more slippity-slidey. They are really laying it on thick. Seems like Cruisin' World wasn't all that then, according to N64 Magazine anyway. Certainly not one for the ages. Ah well, can't win them all. This page from N64 Magazine, harking back to October 98, features a review of a game called Chopper Attack. Right on the front it says Wild Choppers arrives west as ta-da! Chopper Attack. A bit dramatic if you ask me. It seems they had a look at the Japanese version before, called Wild Choppers, in issue 11, and now we're getting the proper release. Looking at the screenshots, it's your typical helicopter shoot-'em-up affair, lots of explosions and blocky landscapes. The reviewer reckons it's not much to look at, a bit formulaic even, but somehow they found themselves enjoying it more than they expected. They say it's got simple missions, and you're constantly battling tanks, planes, and rival choppers. Sounds like a right old button basher. They've given it a score breakdown thingy. Visuals are 6, sounds a respectable 8, mastery a 6, lifespan 7, and overall a score of 81%. Not bad, not amazing. The verdict at the bottom sums it up. Few frills and average graphics don't stop Chopper Attack from being a simple yet engrossing shoot-'em-up. Great fun. So a decent enough time waster then, Crinter. There's a little box at the top left reminding you about their previous look at Wild Choppers, and some tips. And over on the right, a random bit about Super Hang-On. Apparently if you look closely in that game you can spot a bloke hanging onto your bike. They said you can try and shake him off but he hangs on regardless. Bit odd that. I know. Game info box says Chopper Attack GT. Out now. 64 meg cartridge. Needs a controller pack and rumble pack and costs £55. Blimey. Games were pricey back then, weren't they? All in all, Chopper Attack seems like a perfectly average, maybe slightly better than average, shoot-'em-up for the N64. Good for a bit of mindless fun. This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at Buck Bumble. Remember that Ubisoft's B-themed shooter? They'd actually previewed it before according to the previously in N64 bit at the top. They do say the training mode is a decent touch, good for beginners. Looking at the pictures, you are Buck Bumble, some sort of cyborg bee fighting mutant insects. Very 90s. In it, the review seems a bit on the fence, reckons it's for kids, but the controls are a bit awkward. Apparently there are 22 levels, loads of garden settings, 360-degree movement, all the usual stuff, but they're wondering who's going to actually buy it. It was 50 quid for a 96 meg cartridge and came out in October time. Even mentions it's got half Rumble Pack support. Right then. This page here is all about the Doom buggies from Buck Bumble, right? It's breaking down some of the beasties you'll be facing in the game. They've got the Giz Beetle, nasty little things that spit acid, apparently best dealt with from a distance, crafty-like. Then there's the Transporter, big blokes that explode, good for a bit of satisfying destruction. Killer Pillar sounds a bit dodgy, you can snipe them from afar, but get too close and plasma cannons will have your number. Wasps MK1, fast and dive bombing, dangerous impacts they reckon, which sounds about right for wasps, doesn't it? Crane flies are just target practice apparently, bit pointless, and mines are hover mines obviously, set positions, explodey the usual. Over on the side there, in the buzzwords bit, the reviewer's having a bit of a laugh, being all witty and that, talking about avoiding dreadful puns. Seems like someone called Andrea would have punched him in the face if he'd gone overboard with bee jokes. He's going on about be or not to be. Let it be. Mentions Honey I Shrunk the Killer Pillar, and something about a B-movie box out. Bit much if you ask me. Oh, and he's moaning about the game not having a password system. Proper old school whinge that is. Down at the bottom, it mentions first-person view for more precise aiming, which was always a bit clunky back then, wasn't it? All in all, just a bit of a look at what you'll be shooting at in Buck Bumble. Typical preview stuff, really. This page from N64 Magazine, likely from around 98, is having a look at Buck Bumble. Remember that one? It's doing a walkthrough for a level called Radar Run. Seems like they're trying to communicate the game's better bits using this, rather than a proper review. So, Buck Bumble. Right, it was one of those mission-based shoot-em-ups, but you were a cyborg bee. This level, Radar Run, looks like the first mission, tasking you to destroy 3 radar dishes. The walkthrough is broken down into numbered bits, like they all were back then, with screen grabs showing you what to do. Radar Raya. Step 1 starts you off, pointing out your mission. Then it moves on to locked portals, suggesting you scout around for cables to find a way through. Number 3 is about shooting buildings to progress, bit of pipeline action apparently. Number 4 is about opening things up, brains and all that, classic game talk. Going down the page, there's mention of infinite weaponry with a cheat, and using guided missiles against the chops, which I guess are enemies. They point out collectibles for points, nothing new there. Then it's on to the first radar dish, telling you to get your big guns out but to be careful. Clear the area of crane flies, they say, which look like dragonflies. For players who aren't fully kitted out, they mention a rocket launcher hidden in the shadow of the radar. You can use your basic laser, but explosives are quicker, naturally. There's a bit about needing directions and using walls for cover to limit enemy attack angles. They mention ammo on a ledge after destroying a radar dish, encouraging exploration. Finally, it's on to picking off wasps in the open, saying their attack patterns are fairly predictable if you're brave enough, or just hiding from them down the garden. It ends with taking out a squadron of wasps, and apparently the best way to combat them is from different positions, especially when they're attacking from different angles. Down at the bottom there's a bum note section, typical magazine humor, something about military issue bees and colored asses, very mature, and a bit about Argonaut Software, who made Star Fox on the SNES, being behind Buck Bumble, which is probably the most interesting bit of the page really. They call it a dodgy name but say it's trying to be something different. Mildly entertaining, visually average, questionably anthropomorphic they reckon. Not a disaster, but not amazing either. Sounds about right for Buck Bumble if I'm honest. This page from N64 Mag, yeah, I remember this one, it's all about Buck Bumble. Right then, let's have a butcher's. To level walkthrough looks like they're guiding you through a specific area. Each numbered bit points out something in the game. Tubber. So, number 14. Another locked door and a pond. Apparently if Buck falls in water he's a goner. Number 15 is another doorkeeper type enemy. Blast the building to open it up. Number 16, more exploding pipes heading towards the door. There's a pattern apparently. Number 17, go through a portal, and you can see loads of wasps in the distance. Best get rid of them. Number 18, after a fight you can collect nectar to replenish energy, that's handy. Number 19, is that supposed to be a wheelbarrow? Wonder what's inside. Moving on, number 20, goodies. Energy pickups in this area. Number 21, A strange construction on the ground. Can it be blown up? Of course it can. Number 22. And the passageway underneath. Makes sense. Number 23. Through a tunnel a message pops up about weevils. You need to destroy the radars in the area. They're heavy duty and fire with cannons. Best attack from behind and above. Number 24. Having blown up the weevils, temporal or ethereal insects are supposed to go when they die, whatever that means. Number 25. Big pool of water with lily pads. Got to use them to get across. Number 26. A teleporter and gizbeetles. Heavily defended with mines and cannons. Cluster bombs for the lily pad are handy in this area. Number 27. Through the teleporter is the final radar and a new building. Spawns gizbeetles. Not essential to blow it up, but points are points. Number 28. Last radar bites the dust, then Buck is teleported away. Number 29. Score in save option. Bonus score is 0. If you weren't fast enough, go back and do it in ultra fast time to prove your worth. Lie. Down at the bottom, visuals. They're talking about the misty English garden look. Says it's probably why larger areas look dreadful. And then voice of the beehive. Oh yeah, the music. They reckon Buck Bumble has some of the worst music ever heard in a game. Maybe jungle trance with someone singing reggae over the top. A real stinker apparently. Bring back Wipeout, eh? Bit harsh maybe, but it was a bit repetitive, wasn't it? Still, Buck Bumble, it had its moments, didn't it? Never quite a classic though. The next page then features a game called 2B-Doo-Be-Doo, which turns out to be Buck Bumble. Right then? So it's a review in N64 Magazine, probably from back in '98 looking at the style. Seems like a bit of a quirky game where you play as a bee. They're going on about loop-de-loops and how you can't strafe like in Turok, which was a big thing back then, wasn't it? Apparently controlling the little fella is tricky, he's prone to losing altitude. Which sounds about right for a bee, I suppose, if you think about it. Visually, they're not exactly blown away, are they? Fog's awful, P's super, wall textures could be varied. Pretty blunt stuff. Sounds are annoying, but clever theme tune that will get stuck in your head. Classic N64 jingle material then. Mastery is low, multiplayer games are unique though, so maybe that's something. Lifespan is a 7, so not too bad. Multiplayer options and secrets to discover must be helping that. Boring to know. Verdict is a 70%. Not a great game, but not a mess. Worth a look. But be sure to go beyond the first level or so. Bit lukewarm, eh? They reckon Buck Bumble is average in too many ways. Playable yet unspectacular. Pleasant enough way to while away a few hours. Be brilliant? Hardly, according to them. There are a couple of screenshots, one showing a first-person view with some kind of gun or something, and another with a couple of bees kicking a football into a goal. Looks like a multiplayer mode. They mention 2 multiplayer options, Buck Battle, which is deathmatch, and Buck Ball, which is like bee football. Sounds a bit daft, but in a good way maybe. They say Buck Battle is tricky, and matches can last ages. Buck Ball is slow-moving. Bee focus. Overall, it's not a rave review, but not a trashing either. Buck Bumble sounds like one of those slightly odd N64 games that might be worth a rent from Blockbuster if you're bored one weekend, but probably not a must-buy full-price title. Average and a bit quirky sums it up nicely, I reckon. This page is a look at a Japanese import game called Rakuga Kids. It seems to be a beat-em-up fighter, and they are calling it a graffiti fighter, which is a bit of a weird one. They have spotlighted 3 of the characters. First up is Bear Tank, who they say is a sleepy sort of fella who likes blowing snot bubbles, and his attacks are all jungle animal themed. He sounds a bit daft really. Then there's Masa. She's a girl with a chicken hat, and she uses all sorts of things for attacks like frying pans and parachutes. Seems a bit random. And lastly, Captain Cat Kit, who they call hip and groovy. A break-dancing cat who uses musical instruments in his attacks and is a bit sadistic apparently, clapping Masa's head with cymbals. Charming. Go! Looking at the screenshots, it's certainly a colourful game. Quite cartoon-like in a Yoshi's Island sort of way. They reckon it's a beat-em-up where you graffiti walls and then fight, which is a novel idea I suppose. They go on about the characters being thrown in UFO catchers and run over by pizza mopeds. It all sounds a bit bonkers to be honest. They say if you like silly humour you might like it, and it's a bit like Street Fighter 2 in terms of fighting. The little box there says it's out now in Japan, and we'll never know when or if it's coming out here. It's 96 megs, and you'll need a controller pack for 40 pages, whatever that means. It's gonna cost you about 35 quid if you import it, which was a fair bit of pocket money back then. This page from the mag is doing a bit on Rakuga Kids. Looks like it's in the import section. They're showing off some of the characters you can play as. First up is Astronauts, apparently the most hated kid in Twinkletown, according to someone called Andy. He's a weirdo floating about, says he's deeply unsettling, charming. Then we have Cools Roy, who's like a Wild West gunslinger. His artist, Roy, is a dreamer apparently. He's got a Gatling gun and uses TNT. Sounds a bit much for a kid's game. Next there's Robot CHO, drawn by Jerry, who they reckon is a troubled boy on heavy medication, which is a bit much in it. He's all about electricity and throwing robots around. Finally, Mamezo, drawn by Val, who's a fat kid who doesn't like losing. Apparently he's the cheeky one, cracking jokes and flashing his nether regions. Lovely. There's a bit about the game's drawing style, saying you can play as simple charcoal drawings, but they reckon it's a waste of time when the main characters are so colourful. Probably right. They've got a box about accessibility. Mostly in English, no problems there then. Then there's these ratings: 8 for visuals, 7 for sounds, 4 for mastery, bit low for mastery, and 8 for lifespan. The verdict at the bottom says it's a beat-em-up that looks like nothing else, and fight a bit like Street Fighter 2. They've given it 80%. Not bad score that. This page is an import review from issue 20 of N64 Magazine, looking at YLA Country Club, True Golf Classics on the N64. It seems like they'd previously reviewed the Japanese version of YLA Golf back in issue 14. Right off the bat, the reviewer is a bit sarcastic, saying if you already own Augusta Masters, buying this would be a silly move because they are basically the same game but with different courses due to licensing. They've given YLA Country Club a score of 49%, which isn't great, is it? The review breaks down into visuals, sounds, mastery and lifespan. For visuals, it gets a measly 3 out of 5, saying the graphics are poor, low resolution, and the crowd bitmaps are unforgivable. Sounds also get a 3, with complaints about the awful commentary, preferring the Japanese version in Augusta Masters. Mastery scores a 1, saying it's a simple genre but still does things badly. Lifespan gets a 5, suggesting there are plenty of play modes if you can put up with it. Kaba. The verdict box at the bottom basically says it's only about 2% more enjoyable than the Japanese version, but they still recommend you switch off your N64. Ouch. It's pretty brutal. The reviewer, James Price, seems to think it's just not a very good game, even for its time. He talks about dodgy visual engines, poor gameplay, and a clunky control system. He does give it a few extra points for having English text though. Essentially, it sounds like a rushed, lazy port of Augusta Masters, with a different name and courses, and not a very good golf game overall. The screenshots show some blocky-looking golfers, and fairly basic graphics, which backs up the visual complaints. It's a bit of a stinker, really. This page has got a right stinker of a review for Bomberman Battle Phoenix 64. Apparently Hudson were trying something a bit different, calling them sub-games, but the bloke reviewing it here in N64 Magazine isn't having any of it, saying there's no real game to it. It seems to be based on those Japanese toys, B-Damon, where you fire little balls from these things. He's saying it's a compendium of cryo games, which doesn't sound too promising, does it? Looking at the screenshots, you can see a few of these sub-games. There's one where you're shooting dinosaurs. Apparently if you shoot them in the mouth you get points. Then there's another one where you shoot these pop-up heads, but you're penalized for shooting the cute and fluffy ones, which is a bit odd. There's a pool game, which he says is the best of the lot, but even then it's not saying much by the sounds of it. And there's one where you have to knock balls into the opponent's area, like some weird football, and another one where you shoot doors to get to the end of a corridor. Sounds a bit all over the place, doesn't it? Voh. They've given it ratings for things like visuals and sounds both 2s out of 5, so pretty ropey then. Mastery gets a 1, which I think means it's dead easy, and not in a good way, and lifespan gets a 3, which is alright I suppose. Overall, the verdict is a measly 23%. They reckon it's just loads of forgettable sub-games. Not exactly a must-have for the N64 then, definitely one to avoid if you were browsing the rental shop back in the day. This page is a review of Choro Q64. It's in the import section, penny racing they've called it. Right then, so it's about these little toy cars with clockwork engines, bit like the real-life ones, apparently big in Japan for customizing and racing. The reviewer reckons they're a bit slow, like properly slow, almost painful to watch crawl along. They mention the control system being alright, you can do power slides and 90-degree rolls with a horn toot, which sounds a bit daft. It seems like the cars are sluggish at first but get better with upgrades. There's a multiplayer mode and track editor, which is standard stuff really for back then. Suba. Visually they've given it a 5, saying it's slightly cute but very cheap looking. Sound is also a 5, hairdryer noises and tinkly tunes. Not exactly cutting edge audio then. Mastery gets a 4, saying it looks and plays like nout, like a proper 64-bit game. Ouch. Lifespan gets a 6, figure out the options and it might last you, which doesn't sound overly enthusiastic. The verdict is a bit of a downer. There's a game in there somewhere but we're damned if we can find it. Ouch again. Overall score is 56%, which is not great, is it? They reckon it's not exciting enough like Mario Kart or Diddy Kong Racing. Sounds like a bit of a miss then, maybe one to skip. Warrington Nork. There's a bit about accessibility, it's in Japanese, and coming to the UK in November. They mention different cars to choose from, and something about a spinning top attack. Yeah, doesn't sound like I missed out on much back in the day. This page features a review of Super Robot Spirits for the Nintendo 64. Right then, another anime tie-in beat 'em up. Apparently it's got loads of robots from Japanese cartoons that would be familiar to kids over there and busy. Well, some Western manga fans maybe. They mention Transformers and Gundam being really popular, so you can see where they're coming from. The screenshots show some blocky 3D robot action, not exactly pushing the N64 to its limits visually, are they? One caption mentions Domenkashu's special attack, so clearly there are some recognizable robot characters in there. Another one talks about Gundam etiquette, which is a bit of a laugh. Corns must be inspected. There's another one about violating the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and remembering the Countryside Code. Sounds like they're having a bit of fun with the captions. The review itself is fairly lukewarm. They mention Die Master Gundam, Eat Plasma Beam, Dankuga, Kaboom, which is the kind of thing we were seeing in cartoons at the time. They reckon it's a simple beat 'em up, not exactly groundbreaking stuff, comparing it to games that even Hudson and Konami had struggled with on the N64. Ouch. They say the graphics are basic, characters pasted onto flat backgrounds, and the sound is a bit hit and miss. Some are ropey, some are not. Mastery is apparently not today thanks, and lifespan is only good for a short while. Overall, they give it a 58%, calling it a crushing disappointment for fans of the cartoons, and just another average beat 'em up on the N64. Sounds about right for a licensed game back then. Didn't they often promise more than they delivered? Well, you win some, you lose some. This page right then, it's a how-to guide from N64 Magazine. Proper retro stuff. The headline screams about how to grunt, sweat, punch and wedgie your way to victory in WWF Warzone. Blimey wedgies. Very mature. The main picture is of Stone Cold Steve Austin, looking all pumped up like he's just won a title or something. Blimey way. It's all about WWF Warzone on the N64, and apparently it's a bit of alright, but not as good as the WCW vs NWO game on the N64, which they call sharper, faster, smarter and harder. Bit of a backhanded compliment then. They mention it's even better in multiplayer, so you can tag team with your mates. There are some screenshots from the game, blocky as you'd expect for the time, showing The Rock and someone called Ahmed, mid-match. One of the screenshots has a comment about a ballet-style lifting move that's a bit much, and they both end up on the canvas. Sounds like a bit of a clunky game if I'm honest, but we probably loved it back then anyway. They review WWF Wrestlathon in issue 19, so it's a recurring theme in the mag. Essentially, it's a guide to get you started with WWF Warzone, full of tips and tricks, all in classic N64 magazine style. This page is all about getting better at WWF Warzone on the N64. Proper button basher's guide this is. It's called Basic Tips and Tricks, fair enough. First off, they're telling beginners to pick Bret Hart or the British Bulldog. Good choices, both pretty solid wrestlers in the game, and in real life back then too of course. They reckon they're easy to get to grips with, good for running moves and holding their own in a fight, which is probably true. They suggest just learning a few basic moves to start, hip toss and drop kick, that sort of thing. Sensible advice really, no need to be pulling off rock bottom straight away. Met. There's tips for staying away from your opponent when they get up, recovering energy outside the ring, classic cheap tactic that we all did that back in the day, didn't we? Also some bits about comeback attacks when your rival is stood over you, rolling, grappling, which they admit is a bit rubbish in Warzone, always was a bit clunky to be fair. Extra damage, recover faster, raising the pain meter for submissions, all the usual wrestling game stuff. Later. Then there's reversals, getting your opponent out of the ring, posing and taunting, showing off was always part of it. Focus, cage matches. Remember those? Jumping off the top of the cage, good times. And even a cheeky tip for an unblemished record, basically quit out if you're losing, haha, very sportsmanlike. There's a bit about random select, if you can't be bothered choosing a wrestler. And then a funny little bit called dizziness, telling you how to make the wrestlers dizzy in the biography screen. Bit of a pointless Easter egg, but whatever. Magazines were full of that kind of filler back then. Screenshots wise, you can see The Rock, Ahmed, Goldust, Mankind, Undertaker, Shawn Michaels, Bulldog and Farouk, all scrapping in the ring. It's all very blocky N64 graphics, looks a bit dated now, doesn't it? But back then, this was cutting-edge polygon-pushing action, or so we thought anyway. Good times. This page from N64 Magazine, right, takes me back. It's all about WWF Warzone on the N64, that wrestling game that was pretty big at the time. Looking at it now, it's a bit clunky compared to what we get these days, but back then, smashing your mates with a steel chair in this was top entertainment. The page is basically a how-to guide for the game. It starts off with daft things like changing your wrestler's outfit. Apparently you could do it on the bio screen, and even in-game by holding all the C buttons and pressing A. They even mention Goldust's alternative costume, which, yeah, was something else back then. Then it gets into the moves. Punches, uppercuts, drop kicks, the basics really. There's a bit on weapon use, like picking up chairs, and even a telly to whack your opponent with. No mercy, is the headline for just beating someone senseless with a weapon after you've stunned them. They're not wrong, that was a laugh riot with mates. It even gives you tips on how to disarm someone trying to use a weapon on you, which is handy. There's also a section on the damage meter, explaining how to get the crowd going so your moves do more damage. Apparently if you use different moves and get the crowd chanting your name, you could do loads more damage. Clever stuff. Finally, there's a cheap tactics section, win with minimum effort, for beating the computer. It's all about stunning your opponent, climbing the turnbuckle, and drop kicking them repeatedly. Standard stuff for anyone wanting to cheese the game a bit, wasn't it? Looking at the screenshots, you've got Steve Austin, Shawn Michaels, Mankind, Goldust, Ahmed, Owen Hart, Shamrock, Mosh, all the big WWF names from around 98. Yeah, this page is a proper blast from the past for anyone who was into wrestling games on the N64 back in the day. This page is all about getting the upper hand in your wrestling games on the N64, mainly WWF WrestleMania 2000 it looks like. There's a how-to guide for winning the Royal Rumble, suggesting you pick someone like Bret Hart and keep doing his overhead suplex, which is apparently left punch, to chuck people out of the ring. They reckon the computer tag partners are a bit useless, always jumping in at the wrong time. There are also some tips on focusing and tagging in matches, and a cheeky dirty cheating tactic if you're playing against a mate. Then there's a whole section on cheats. Apparently, there are loads hidden away, mostly unlocked by winning the championship with certain wrestlers. For the basement area in WWF Warzone, you tap L, then R at the main menu to see your secret characters. The trainer cheat lets you fight the secret wrestlers by highlighting training, pressing A at the gym, and boom, a message pops up. Some of the other cheats they've found are a polished floor, a no wimps cheat, ladies night to get female wrestlers, ego mode which makes the wrestlers' heads bigger, no meters, and a helping hand from another wrestler. Oh, and you can even get a bit of blood in weapons matches by whacking someone with a weapon like the bell. Apparently you see tiny drops of blood, which wasn't exactly Mortal Kombat levels of gore, was it? Good times. This page then is from an old N64 mag, looks like a how-to guide, specifically about finishing moves in WWF Warzone. Right then, Warzone, remember that? It was alright, for its time I suppose. Vexus. Anyway, this page is all about showing you how to pull off the special moves for the wrestlers. Each wrestler has their signature move detailed, like Stone Cold Steve Austin's Stone Cold Stunner, which apparently is LEFT, UP block, and tie-up. Sounds about right, bit fiddly to remember in the heat of the moment, mind you. They've got The Undertaker's Tombstone, which is down, 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 punch and tie-up, nice and straightforward. British Bulldog's Running Power Slam is in there too. Oh, and Shamrock's ankle lock submission hold, always a crowd pleaser, if you could actually manage to get it to work. Rocky's Rock Bottom, of course, left, up punch and tie-up, simple but effective. Then you've got some of the less, shall we say, main event wrestlers featured. Goldust and his Curtain Call, Farouk's Dominator, Ahmed Johnson's Pearl River Plunge, and even Thrasher from the Headbangers doing a stage dive. Mosh Pit is in there too, for Mosh, naturally. Shawn Michaels gets a mention for Sweet Chin Music, and Mankind with the Mandible Claw. Kane's Tombstone is just a copy of Undertaker's, isn't it? Always was, naturally. Each move has a little screenshot to show you what it looks like in-game. Bit blocky looking now, innit? But back then, on the N64, it was alright. This page is telling you when to use them when your opponent's energy is red, and to taunt or pose before doing it for extra style points. Well, brownie points at least. Good to know. This page reveals the competition results from N64 Magazine. Seems they had a couple of crackers on the go. First up was Yanks a Lot. A bit of a play on words, I suppose, where folks had to come up with something that just screamed USA. The prizes for that one were a load of American tat, like a dodgy passport, Disney dollars, and even some genuine American dirt apparently. Bit odd, but hey, it's the thought that counts. Then there was Quake with Fear, for the scary game fans. People had to try and make the N64 Magazine crew jump out of their skins, which sounds like a laugh. The prize for that one was a copy of Quake on the N64, and another N64 console, or some runner-up prizes. Quake was pretty big back then. Proper first-person shooter stuff on consoles was still a bit of a novelty at the time. They reckon some of the entries for both comps were a bit daft, but also some were quite good, which is usually the way with these things, isn't it? Roll up and on, as they say. This page is a bit of a random collection, isn't it? Looks like they were having an American-themed day in the office. Right at the top there's some guff about Jelly Belly beans, apparently as American as apple pie, but made in Italy, which is a bit of a swizz. Then a load of American snacks, you know the sort. Sugary rubbish like M&Ms and Reese's Sticks, probably sent over for review or something. There's a pile of basketball cards, Hawks, Rockets, Pistons. Standard NBA stuff, probably trying to flog off some merchandise, or maybe they just had a basketball fan in the office. Mixed in with that are some drawings, Simpsons characters of course, always popular back then, and a picture of Cameron Diaz and Jennifer Aniston, probably someone's idea of American beauty icons. Bit cheesy really. Down below we've got comic books, X-Men and Iron Man, Bartman, which was the Simpsons comic, wasn't it? And even Goosebumps. For the younger readers, I suppose. Seems they're stacked up with Marvel stuff mostly, and someone's moaning about not having any Spider-Man comics, typical. There's a McDonald's hat, and someone saying whoever owns it is skeeving off work on a Saturday. Then a homemade 10-pin bowling game, looks a bit rough and ready, but fair play for the effort. And a Be an American kit, sounds like a bit of a joke prize, made by some Mario Kart champ, apparently. Inside the kit is a list of bits and bobs, a handbook, posh coffee, a QVC card, burger token, and a Jerry Springer ticket. Be an May, very American, very random, and lastly, a packet of coffee, must have been part of that American theme, all double late medium roast, triple chocochino, or some such nonsense. Just a bit of fun in the office, I suppose, probably padding out the magazine before the proper game reviews. This page is about competition winners in N64 Magazine back in '98. Right at the top there's a winner for a drawing. Someone called Perry Harris from Bath won an N64 in 3 games for redoing that famous American painting, you know, the one with George Washington crossing the Delaware River. But instead of soldiers, it's all Nintendo characters in the boat. They've got Fox McCloud from Lilac Wars at the front, then Bomberman, Goemon from Mystical Ninja, Mario, Donkey Kong, Banjo, Earthworm Jim, Link, Diddy Kong, Yoshi, Princess Daisy, and Luigi at the back. Bit of a random mix, but it's quite funny to see them all like that. Then there's another winner section, this one for a video competition called Quake with Fear. Apparently they asked readers to make scary videos, and this fella Stuart Farrimond and Simon Godfrey from Jersey won. Their 6-minute horror film called Fear was the best. They said it was like a Channel Islands version of Halloween with a soundtrack by Offspring and Metallica, and the camera work was wobbly. Sounds very 90s student film. They've got some stills from the film showing scary titles, a bloke looking terrified, and some blurry monster thing. Underneath, there's a Runners UP section. Dave Drew from Dudley made a Shambler's Cousin model, whatever that is. Ryan Orris from Barnhurst made a freak box that's supposed to be disturbing. Matthew Harper from Gloucester sent in a 6.4DD model with old record bits inside. Sounds a bit crafty. Dave Martin from Athlone sent in a dried scorpion in a package that jumps out at you, which apparently made them jump in the office. Then there's Christophe Villas from Belgium who did the best Quake artwork. Chris O'Toole from Runcorn made an all-seeing blood-filled eye. Lovely. Carol Doherty from Darlington did a David Hopkins stereo picture. Mike Ridley from Belfast did a worrying Tokyo World front page thing, and Darren Atwood from Blackpool dressed up as Norman Bates' mum. Sounds like they got some right weird and wonderful entries. This page is a bit of a classic tip section from N64 Magazine, back when we actually got our gaming news from paper, can you believe it? It's all about getting the upper hand in some of the big games of the time. First up, they've got a classic tip for GoldenEye 007. Everyone was obsessed with GoldenEye back then, weren't they? It's about finding hidden weapons on the train level and the water caverns level. Apparently, if you blow up certain boxes you can find RCP-90s and assault rifles. Handy for taking down those pesky guards. Then there's a section on Mission Impossible. This game was trying to be all sneaky and gadgety like GoldenEye, but it wasn't quite in the same league, was it? They've got secret weapons codes you can enter at the mission select screen. These codes give you extra weapons like a mini rocket launcher, a 9mm, high power with loads of rounds, an Uzi, and a 7.65 silencer. Bit overkill for a stealth mission, innit? They even have a Meet the Team section, showing Ethan Hunt and talking about the Prague mission, and getting a bonus animation from Nathan if you max out your health. Sounds like a bit of fluff to me, but hey, magazines needed to fill pages, didn't they? Boring. Finally, there's Off-Road Challenge. Remember that one? Monster trucks and mud, quite a different vibe from spies and shooters. They've got a turbo start tip, telling you to press the accelerator just as the announcer says, set, for a nitro boost at the beginning of the race. Sounds tricky to time right. And then there are secret tracks you can unlock. To get El Cajon, Flagstaff, and Guadalupe, you have to hold certain D-pad and shoulder button combinations while selecting the track. A bit convoluted, but that's how they did things back then, wasn't it? Hidden stuff for the dedicated gamer to find. Ah, simpler times. This page from N64 Magazine, it's a right trip down memory lane, isn't it? It's all about readers' tips, like we used to send in back in the day. Seems like GoldenEye 007 is still king, with about half the tips dedicated to it. One fella, Phil Palmer, reckons he's found a way to move the camera in the cutscenes, which sounds a bit fiddly, but fair play to him for figuring it out. Another tip for GoldenEye is about Aramov's key in the silo level. Typical GoldenEye secrets, weren't they always full of them? There's one about the password in Robotron 64, and another for Forsaken 64 to get to level 0%, which sounds like a right pain if you ask me. Then there's another GoldenEye one for the Cradle level, involving grenades and Trevelyan. Sounds messy. There's also a tip for WCW vs NWO about doing a trademark move, which is alright if you were into wrestling games. And another GoldenEye tip, this time for the train level and getting into the N cabin. Blimey, people were obsessed with GoldenEye back then, weren't they? Lastly, there's one for NBA Courtside about a glitch with dunking, and one for Snowboard Kids about using boards from multiplayer in singleplayer. DT. Then you've got the Reader's Datel Codes section for your cheat devices, remember those? GoldenEye 007 gets a few more codes for things like laser sights and RCP-90s. Then there are some for Fighter's Destiny and Snowboard Kids for extra stars and infinite cash, that sort of thing. John Hewson from West Yorkshire and Yusri Housen from Kent are mentioned for sending those in. At the bottom, there's a call for more tips and a form to fill out if you found any secret bits or quirky things in your games. They'd even send you a flash N64 pin badge if your tip was good enough, and something extra special if you got Cheat of the Month. Ah, the simpler times of gaming magazines, eh? Good times. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 20, looks like it's giving us the lowdown on some of the trickier bits in Banjo-Kazooie. It's got a section called the Nintendo Hotline, saying if you've got a game problem and can't call them, this magazine is printing the best stuff. Sounds like they were trying to be helpful back in the day, bless them. The main bit is all about Banjo-Kazooie common questions, split into World 1, Mumbo's Mountain, and World 2, Treasure Trove Cove. For Mumbo's Mountain, they're tackling how to defeat the giant ape in the tree. Apparently you have to help a little monkey get an orange, then use the flip jump to reach the ape and chuck eggs at him. 3 hits should do it. There's also a question about getting to the jigsaw piece on top of the hill at the entrance to the level. The answer is you gotta visit Mumbo Jumbo, turn into a termite, and climb the mountain. Simple when you know how, eh? Rah. Moving on to Treasure Trove Cove, the question is how to defeat Nipper the giant hermit crab. The magazine says Ratatat wrap his eyes 3 times, and he's done for. Then there's a puzzle about a bucket that needs a pebble. Turns out you just need to use eggs to fill the hole in the bucket, which drains the water and lets you into the castle. Handy tip, that. Finally, there's a bit about where to find all the Jinjos. They've listed them by color and location, like the purple one is at the start on a pedestal. You need the flip jump again for that. Blue is on the island in the water, green is in a hut you got a beak buster. Orange is on the stone pillars near the bridge, and yellow is on the hillside. You need Kazooie to climb up to that one. So there you have it, a Banjo-Kazooie cheat sheet for those tricky moments. Good times. This page right then is all about the Nintendo Hotline, remember that? Back in the day before the internet was in every pocket, if you were stuck on a game you'd actually phone someone. It says here they're a team of experts who know all things Nintendo and reckon they're the perfect coach for your gaming skills. Bit strong maybe, but we were desperate back then. They've got a phone number you could ring for your game questions. 017 036 52222. Not a premium rate number, thank goodness. They're even open evenings and weekends, which was pretty good going. And blimey, they've even got a fully automated service now too, for those really late night emergencies when you're stuck on a boss at 3 AM. Though at 50p a minute you'd better hope you knew what to ask quickly. The actual game tips here are all for Banjo-Kazooie, that rare game everyone was raving about. There's a bloke stuck on a chest, and the answer is to use the Ratatat wrap, or an egg, simple as that. Another one's moaning about Clanker's teeth, and apparently you just need to let Clanker rise up and down and get on the platforms. Then there's someone who can't find the last Jinjo color-coded instructions for those pesky blighters. Blue, green, orange, purple and yellow Jinjos it seems. Handy if you were really struggling. Lukuk. And to top it off, there's a musical note guide for Mumbo's Mountain, Treasure Trove Cove and Clanker's Cavern, listing where all those notes are hidden in the water, on bridges, on huts and all sorts. They've even broken down the total notes for each level. Bet that saved a few arguments with your mates back then about who had the most notes. Good old hotline, eh? Times were different. This page from the magazine is from the letters section. Looks like issue 20. We've got readers writing in about various bits and bobs as you do. Kicking off, there's a letter complaining about the number of female gamers mentioned in the mag. Bit daft, really, gatekeeping and all that, but someone called Billy McDiarmid from Renfrewshire is having a moan about his sister liking Donkey Kong 64 and GoldenEye. Seems a bit insecure if you ask me. Ed, the editor, has a little chuckle about it. Aha. Then there's the star letter from Christopher Tonks in Nottingham, who spotted N64 Magazine for sale in Switzerland. Apparently the mag is read all over Australia, Finland, America, even Norway and New Zealand. Good for them, spreading the word, eh? Next up, Mark Windevar from Liverpool reckons Mumbo from Banjo-Kazooie looks like a Jinjo. Well, he sort of does, in a blocky N64 way. Ed jokes about pink Jinjos and Mumbo in a head-to-head. Bit of harmless fun. There's a slightly defensive piece called Sorry Guys, where Andrew Mills, the deputy ed of N64 Play, is responding to criticism of their N64 Play section from issue 18. Apparently some folks thought their views on Yoshi's story and Mortal Kombat mythologies were a bit harsh, and there was a top 5 women's breasts feature that someone found irrelevant. Honestly, sounds like typical magazine banter from back then. Andrew's basically saying they're standing by their opinions, and they'll review all the mags on the market, and they'll be a big part of the industry. Fairly confident chap. Finally, a correction corner sorting out a few goofs from previous issues. Someone called Adrian Ulsrode in Oslo points out a Rumble Pack error in the Banjo-Kazooie review. Then George Armstrong from Crispin Field, which is apparently a road name, not his actual name, clears up a confusion about his name. And lastly, Ashley Martin Schrader from Great Yarmouth corrects a typo in the F-Zero X review about how to activate the attack. It's tapping Z and double tapping T. Oh, and Quest 64 was called a sports title in the N64 most played column, which is wrong, it's a role-playing game. All standard stuff for a mag's correction page, making sure they get the details right, even if it's about blocky N64 games. This page, well, it's the letters and fact box section, isn't it, from back in the day? And Northtra, right at the top there's a bit about sending in your pocket camera scores for I'm the Best in Skill Club, remember that thing? Someone called Simon wants to know if they'll do a GT64 League Gran Turismo 64 for the young'uns. They say they might if enough people are keen. Get sending in your touring car champ attempts. Then there's a slightly odd one called Small Boy, where a bloke, Chris, is confused about seeing a picture of a kid playing Mario on a PlayStation in issue 18, says it was on page 33. Turns out it's one of the writer's kids, Jack, and apparently he's just out of shot playing Mario on the N64, and it's all about the writer being a professional and keeping up with all consoles, plus something about a door needing propping open. Bit random. Next up, Locked Inside. Some poor soul stuck on the train level in GoldenEye after Aramov, in the last room. Sounds stressful, mate. Cheat section. Someone's been trying to get cheats in Banjo-Kazooie after emptying the Treasure Trove Cove letter room and can't find any extra codes, just the letter cheat, which is accompanied by a mooing go thing. Don't remember that myself, but there you go. Orchestra. Then there's a fact box section about Japanese and American N64 games. Apparently, people might want them because they come out earlier, and some of the Japanese games are different, especially before Rare got going big time. Apparently, the NTSC telesystems looked better and ran faster. Well, that's what they say. They explain the PAL versus NTSC thing, all about screen borders and games running slower on British tellies. Something about 2 leagues for Mario Kart because of it all. Good grief. Sebo. Someone's asking if they can beat the UK release dates by importing, and they go through how to play import games. You need a Japanese or American machine, which means a step-down transformer because the voltage is different. Or you can nick the power pack from your UK N64. Then there's telly stuff. You need a 60Hz telly, and apparently Sony and Grundig tellies are usually alright. If your telly's old and rubbish, you're out of luck. The cheap option is a converter cartridge, but they can be a bit dodgy and mess with the picture, apparently. They say test before you buy. Good advice that. Dorintally. Lastly, Dream On section, about readers' game ideas. Someone called Ashley wants 4-player fighting games, like proper beat-em-ups on the N64, mentions Royal Rumble mode, and Bruce Lee Killer Instinct Clay Fighter. The magazine says it's technically hard to do 4-player fighters, but they're grateful for the ideas. Then Predator 64 inches. Someone, Alex, wants a Predator game where you explore jungles, take out enemies, and hunt the Predator, or avoid being hunted by it. Sounds like a film tie-in waiting to happen. Lastly, Getaway 64. Jason wants a 70s set game with Cadillacs, cop chases around San Francisco, LA, New York, Jumping bridges, vegetable stalls, all the usual. They say they've seen enough of those films now, sarcastic lot aren't they, but say it's an excellent idea. Fair enough. This page of the magazine kicks off with bonus letters, always a good place to see what other gamers were on about. Someone called L. Jameson wants to name their horse after a Zelda reference. A bit of a laugh in it. Then there's Scott Cockcroft wondering about secret areas in Banjo-Tooie, which was the hot game everyone was waiting for back then. He was on about cheat codes and memory packs, proper nerdy stuff we all got into. K-Nay-Nay. Helen Chadwick wants more girls on staff, cheeky. And Robert Mageddon has a funny name apparently. There's a bloke wanting a free copy of Iggy's Wrecking Balls, good luck with that mate. Taro Takeuchi is bragging about finding all the fortune dolls in Mystical Ninja, fair play to him. Then David Payne is having a pop at the Invention Corner, calling it a rip-off, bit harsh, maybe he had sour grapes. Next bit is As a King, where Michael Buchanan is chuffed with his GoldenEye cheat code skills. Then Any Titles asks about 3DO and their games, mentioning Battletank X. Remember 3DO? They promised the world but didn't quite deliver, did they? Though Battletank sounded alright, a bit of tank mayhem in a city. Game names section talks about Flying Dragon, which is apparently Art of Fighting Twin, and Puma Street Soccer, a Diego Maradona footy game. Sounds a bit ropey to be honest. And WCW vs NWO. Revenge is mentioned. Wrestling games were massive then, everyone was doing pile drivers on their mates. Strange Thing is about a Banjo-Kazooie glitch, typical Rare games, always full of secrets and weirdness. Mark Branscombe reckons Mumbo Jumbo turned him into a washing machine by mistake. Sounds about right for that game. Kinsa. Then we get to Conjecture Corner, speculating about future N64 games, especially Rares. James Griffiths thinks they might do a Timber the Tiger beat-em-up, or a Zelda-style RPG. Axel Faulkner fancies a Diddy Kong story game, sort of action-adventure, rescuing his pals from Whizpig. Could have been good actually, if they'd done it right. Tran. Lastly, there's So Tell Me This, asking readers what they want to see on the N64. Standard stuff for a letters page, getting everyone involved. And there's a picture of Banjo-Kazooie with Mumbo Jumbo, yeah, that game was the business. This page is a blast from the past, right out of an old N64 Magazine classified section. You've got your games for sale, where people are trying to shift their old cartridges. Loads of the usual suspects like Top Gear Rally, Super Mario 64, and GoldenEye, naturally. Someone's even trying to flog a color Game Boy, and a load of games, and some fella with a huge retro collection, probably just boxes of SNES games he can't shift. There's a desperate plea for Go troublemakers, which, bless them, no one really wanted back then either. The help wanted bit is brilliant. Someone's stuck on Top Gear Rally and needs a shortcut, probably been on the phone to Nintendo helpline for hours. Then games to swap, now that's where it gets interesting. Seems like everyone and their dog wanted to swap Snowboard Kids. Which is a bit odd, wasn't exactly Mario 64 was it? Loads of requests for swaps, and the usual big hitters are there: GoldenEye, Mario Kart, Diddy Kong Racing, and right at the end, someone's desperately wanted. Zelda 64 probably missed out at Christmas. Takes you back, doesn't it? This page is an article from N64 Magazine. Looks like they are calling it N64 Investigates. Blimey, it's about pocket monsters, or Pokemon as they are calling it now I suppose. Apparently it's already massive in Japan. They're asking if us non-Japanese speaking gamers will get anything out of it. In the previously in N64 bit at the top, it says Max took a look at the Game Boy version of Pocket Monsters back in issue 10, so they've been keeping an eye on this for a bit then. The main image is of that cartoon kid, Ash Menyu's and Pikachu, on his shoulder, holding a Pokeball. It's all very bright and colourful. Definitely aimed at the younger audience, isn't it? They're wondering if this whole monster collecting craze will catch on over here. Seems like a bit of a gamble. It's already huge over in Japan, so who knows, maybe it will be the next big thing. They are definitely intrigued, putting it on a full page like this. This page is about the new Pocket Monsters Stadium game on the N64. It's got a big splash of Pokemon art all over the shop, you know, the usual suspects like Pikachu and Charizard and that. Right at the top it's branded as an N64 star game, which is always a good sign, isn't it? Tay-day. The article, penned by a Max Everingham, seems to be having a bit of a ponder about Nintendo's approach to this Pokemon craze. He mentioned something about Mr. Yamauchi's speech at Spaceworld, and feeling a bit uneasy about the direction Nintendo is going with the kids. Seems a bit dramatic, it's just Pocket Monsters after all. He goes on about how the marketing machine at Nintendo is in full swing and how everyone's lapping it up, especially the kids queuing up for hours to get the game. Bit over the top maybe? But you did see the queues. New Yi. The gist of the game, as he sees it, is that it's not really an RPG like the Game Boy games. It's more of a battle arena thing where your Pokemon from the Game Boy can duke it out in proper 3D. He says it's like sticking your little monsters in a cauldron and seeing what happens. Sounds a bit brutal, doesn't it? But then again, it's battling, in it. Dorcas. Apparently this stadium game is about proving your Pokemon's warrior credentials, not raising them like in the handheld games. He sounds quite relieved about this separation, saying it's a good thing they're not just rehashing the Game Boy stuff on the N64. He mentioned something about the RPG elements in issue 10 being a bit taxing, especially if you're not Japanese with all that text, so this more action-focused approach might be a welcome change for some. Down at the bottom there's a little box with the details. Pocket Monsters Stadium, Nintendo obviously. It says out now in Japan, and for the UK it's TBA, typical. It's a 64 meg cart, uses the controller pack, and you can use a cartridge backup, whatever that is. Price in Japan is about £35. So you know, the usual sort of price for a new N64 game Daka. Overall, it sounds like they're cautiously optimistic about it. A bit of a departure from the usual Pokemon fare, but maybe in a good way. We'll have to see if it lives up to the hype when it finally lands over here. This page, blimey, it's like stepping back in time, isn't it? Right then, so we have a feature called The Duffer's Guide to Po, which I reckon is short for Pokemon Stadium on the N64. It's giving us a breakdown for us clueless Brits trying to get our heads around this import game. Neat. Apparently, if you just hammer the A button on startup, even without understanding Japanese, you can get into the game and even pick your monsters. They are talking about the 64GB pack add-on, which is probably the transfer pack, for using your Game Boy Pokemon games. Says if you don't have a Game Boy cartridge plugged in, you can still play, but you're stuck with the default set of Pokemon. Fair enough. Deal. Then there's a section called Monster Words, which is basically a little translation guide to the main menu. Number 1 is Battle, which is the main game mode, offering tournament or free battle. Number 2 is Off, which apparently switches off the Pokemon operating system. Bit of a weird one that, not sure why you'd want to do that. 3 is Satan, which is for organizing your Pokemon in boxes between the stockroom, Game Boy, and N64 carts. 4 is Zukan, the picture book, which is like your Pokédex showing info on Pokemon. Number 5, GB, lets you play your Game Boy game in sort of half Technicolor, a bit of a novelty I suppose. And 6 is Ichiran, a text list of your monsters and their stats. Handy I guess if you can't read Japanese. Warrington their stat. Up at the top there's a bit called Badges talking about tournament mode, mentioning you get a sad fishing hat and button badges if you win in the Western version, which they're now calling Pocket Monsters. Bit silly if you ask me, badges for losing at Pokemon. It's like school sports day, all over again. And there's a big Pikachu smack bang in the middle, just to remind us what all the fuss is about. Yeah, takes me back, this does. This page is all about Pocket Monsters Stadium, or Pokemon Stadium as we'd probably call it over here. It's showing off how to use the GB Puck, that little add-on for your N64 controller, to link up your Game Boy Pokemon games. You know, Red and Blue, the ones everyone was obsessed with. They're explaining how you can bring your hard-earned Pokemon from your Game Boy game into the stadium on the N64. It mentions you need to go to a Pokemon Center in the Game Boy game and make a report before you can do this link-up. It's all a bit convoluted, but back then, this kind of thing felt pretty cutting edge, didn't it? There are screenshots showing the menus and battles in Stadium, with Pokemon like Bulbasaur and some rock-looking fella duking it out. They're highlighting features like Tomochi, which is about checking your Pokemon, and Taruku for registering your teams. It's all about getting your team ready for Stadium battles, nicking the best monsters from your mates apparently. Whoo! The article talks about the full PMS experience. Bit of a weird abbreviation that, even for then. Basically it's saying that if you want the proper Stadium experience, you really need to hook up your Game Boy game. Makes sense I suppose, it's all about battling your own raised monsters in 3D on the telly, rather than just using the rental ones. It concludes by saying you've now registered your PMS with your Game Boy version, and all systems are go, in a very enthusiastic way. Our memories of fiddling with cables and cartridges to get things to work. Those were the days. This page delves into the monster battling of Pocket Monsters Stadium on the N64. Remember that? It was all the rage back then, trying to emulate the handheld game experience on your telly. The article talks about picking your team and getting into the free battle or tournament modes, which were pretty standard fare for these kinds of games. Apparently, choosing which monsters to send out, and in what order is a big deal. There's some top tips section, sounding a bit like your mum giving you advice, telling you to raise your monsters from low levels and understand the type matchups. Water beats fire, fire beats grass, the usual rock paper scissors stuff. Apparently if you just nick a high level monster from your mate, it won't be as good as one you've trained yourself. Cunning, eh? The visuals are bigged up, talking about explosions of color and some commentator who gets a bit too excited when you mess up. They mention pressing R to attack, and having a mix of offensive and passive moves, things like Blizzard and Megaton Punch. Real imaginative names, those. Then there's a bit called The Art of War, highlighting different Pokemon types and attacks, mentioning electric attacks being good against water types. There are screenshots of an evil orange Pikachu, a Windy, a Gengar and a Chinese dragon-type creature, showing off the battles in action. It's all fairly standard monster battling stuff when you think about it, but back then, it was quite the spectacle on the N64. This page then is all about Pocket Monsters Stadium, or Pokemon Stadium as we'd probably call it over here. Seems to be a review, and they're pretty chuffed with it, giving it a solid 85%. They reckon it's a star game no less. Looking at the breakdown, they've given the visuals a whopping 9 out of 10, saying they could just watch the monsters do their stuff, praising the animations and attack sequences. Sounds gets a 7, saying the commentary is good and ups the pace, but the background music lets it down a bit. Mastery gets a perfect 10, apparently it works seamlessly with the Game Boy game, which they call sheer genius. Lifespan is a 7, but they suggest bumping it up to a 10 if you're under 10 years old, reckons there's loads to do. The verdict is pretty glowing, saying it's more excitement than you should have in a day, and if you're a Pokemon fan it's a must. Decay. There are screenshots of battles. You can see Charizard blasting away, Blastoise looking moody, Pikachu doing its usual electric thing, and even a spooky looking Haunter. They've got little comments dotted around the screenshots too, like one saying, "Woo! This one's a real crowd pleaser." Another pointing out a Weepinbell hanging upside down saying, "Scary upside down monster sticks to the ceiling as only a scary upside down monster ever truly can." There's another one joking about a Diglett looking like Mickey Mouse, bit cheeky that. Overall, seems like they were well impressed with this Pokemon Stadium back in '98. Must have been a big deal seeing those little Game Boy monsters in proper 3D on the telly at the time. Right, good score they gave it, fair play. This page then, right, it's a page from N64 Magazine, and it's all about hyping up Turok 2. Remember Turok? Sort of Doom with dinosaurs, wasn't it? This one was supposed to be even bigger and bloodier, which was always the main drawback then, wasn't it? Bigger, better, gorier, scarier, same old marketing spiel really. They're banging on about a 256 meg cart, which, yeah, for a cartridge game that was pretty massive, meant they could cram loads in. World exclusive review they're calling it, so if you wanted to know if it was any good you had to buy N64 Magazine. Naturally. They list a few things the review will cover: how it plays, all the levels, deathmatch, weapons, and the inevitable question, is it better than GoldenEye? Always had to compare everything to GoldenEye back then, didn't you? Yeah, Turok 2, a lot of people were looking forward to that one, and N64 Magazine wanted you to know they had the inside scoop. This page is issue 21 of the N64 magazine, and boasts a whopping 132 pages, which back then felt like a proper brick of gaming goodness for your Nintendo 64. It's tipping ISNE 8, that's International Superstar Soccer, for your footy fix every day. Reckon they're saying it's got a massive guide for the beautiful game. Right then, Warrington, there's a plus section showcasing a few games. Jet Force Gemini is in there, Rareware doing their thing, and Silicon Valley, which I vaguely remember being about mutant squirrels or something bonkers. Glover is there too, that glove platformer, and Perfect Dark, which was the GoldenEye follow-up we were all gagging for, though maybe a bit too much hype at the time. And Top Gear Overdrive, another racer, because we could never have enough racers on the N64 back then. Tone. Looks like 12 Tales Conquer 64 inches is featured as well, that was rare again, before it went all adult and edgy later on. There's a tipped section, with bullet points saying first news on every new N64 game, Skill Club 64, I'm the best, and stacks of tips, just the usual magazine fodder to keep you interested. Then they're shouting free twice. First one is, our double game guide plus strips down new N64 games to their bare bones. Blimey, strips down to their bare bones. Bit much, isn't it? It's just a guide, probably for Banjo-Kazooie judging by the picture, which was a cracking game to be fair. A proper collectathon from Rare again. The second free is The Ultimate Mission Impossible Guide, written by the developers themselves. Well, that sounds like a bit of a boast. Didn't Mission Impossible come out on PlayStation and N64? Can't remember if it was any good. And lastly, another free plus an extra special gift worth pounds this. It'll really happen this month, we promise. Do? Cryptic as always, magazine freebies were always a bit hit and miss, weren't they? Probably a keyring or something. The magazine is on sale Monday the 5th of October and proudly proclaims N64 Magazine Official. Right you are then. This page is the quiz from N64 Magazine, issue 20. Always a bit of a giggle, wasn't it? They're dangling £50 as a carrot. Enough for a few games back then, not bad. The questions are all about N64 games, of course. Like which bands did the soundtrack for Wipeout 64, and who was the big gaming personality coming to the UK that September must be Peter Molyneux and something about black and white maybe. They're asking the score for F1 World Grand Prix in the mag, how many games from Konami were featured, and what DMA design we're up to after Body Harvest and Silicon Valley, probably something Space Station Silicon Valley shaped. Questions also on Scars, Rogue Squadron, Biofreaks, ODT and even Cruisin' World. Over on the right, there's the index for the magazine, listing all the reviews and bits and bobs inside. Looks like reviews for Biofreaks, Rogue Squadron, Castlevania 64, F1 World Grand Prix, Cruisin' World and more. How to enter details and rules are down below. Closing date October 10th, 1998. Pretty standard quiz fare for a mag of the time.